The people standing in the square shouted with one voice for the young lady to be executed. They shouted that she was a devil with the appearance of a virgin. Kira Farvis, the sinner, who fooled an entire empire. The man looked at her intently and said that she must pay in full for her crime. Looking at the young lady, he coldly ordered his subordinates to carry out the sentence. A moment later, the young lady ran up to her father and called him tenderly. She asked her father why he came so close to the lady, because she was dangerous for them. Kira, in turn, was furious and tried to say something, but it was all in vain. The young lady turned around and looked intently at the criminal. But a moment later, her gaze changed, and she looked at Kira with a smirk, rejoicing in her victory. Kira was shocked. She wanted to shout something, but all attempts were unsuccessful. Kira remembered how the girl came to her in the dungeon, and with a grin, said that soon her execution would take place, and she would show her something for the last time. A moment later, she used her magic, and a light shone in the dungeon. Kira was shocked because she saw drops of water and felt an unknown feeling. She felt the presence of the spirit of water. The lady told Kira, with a smirk, that she saw spirits, and this was proof that she was the real daughter of that stupid man. The lady said with a smirk that she was noble and pure-blooded, but in the end, she became a sinner because everyone thought that she was the fake daughter of the Grand Duke. The girl looked at her with a smirk and said that it was all actually a big lie because Kira was actually real. Kira froze in shock as she didn't expect to hear anything like that. As she left, the young lady looked at her with a grin and said that they would see each other tomorrow before she executed her. Kira was furious, but unfortunately she couldn't say anything. The next day, all present stared at the girl in anticipation of her execution. The young lady looked at Kira with a smirk and said that she was pathetic. Later, after the title of Grand Duke was awarded to the new successor, the status of the newly minted Duke's title suddenly fell, and a great crisis arose on the continent. There was a prophecy about the shield of salvation from disasters. Only one child would be born, blessed by the spirit, the family of water spirits chosen by the goddess House Farvis. The daughters of the house, upon reaching adulthood, could hear and feel the great spirits. The gift of the invisible demon brought rain to the parched continent. Kira is Ludwig's first daughter, Farvisa. According to the prophecy, she was considered the only gifted one. The girl grew up to be a sincere and kind lady, but in turn, she wanted only one thing. She sincerely desired her father's love. Kira lost her mother at an early age, and naturally she craved her father's love very much. She wondered what she could do to make her father love her. She tried to understand what she had done wrong and was always strict with herself. She tried to learn all the material as quickly as possible in order to become a worthy daughter of her house. The maid praised her mistress with a joyful smile and said that the Duke would also be glad of her success. Kira wondered with a happy smile if she would be able to get praise from her father this time. Sometime later, the pineapple happily ran up to her father as she wanted to show him her success. The Duke, in turn, said that he was very busy, and if she had nothing urgent, she could inform him later. In truth, the Duke never even hugged his daughter. She wanted to attract his attention in any way possible. She understood that if she did something like that, he would come to her. Pushing off, she jumped. Sometime later, the young lady was lying in bed with injuries. She heard someone knocking on the door and screamed, thinking it was her father. The butler looked intently at the young lady and called her. She froze when she saw that her father had not come to her. She was very upset because he did not come to her. She really hoped that he would be able to love her, at least someday. Kira wanted him to come to her and hug her at least once. She really wanted him to look back and not leave. So she lived for 18 years, trying to get her father's recognition. Most likely she would have lived like this her whole life. But one clear day, a girl came to them. She looked at everyone present with a smile and introduced herself, saying that she was the Duchess of Rowena's eldest daughter, Cozette. She introduced herself with a joyful smile and called her father. The Duke looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression on his face. He was surprised and at the same time stunned when she called him father. The Duke looked at her intently and asked if she really meant to say that she was his daughter. Cozette said with a joyful smile that it was all true. Everyone knew that Rowena Weinberg died after exile, being barren. Count Isaac, her older brother, had been missing for 15 years and had not appeared, leaving them wondering where the child had suddenly come from. They didn't know if she was really the Duke's daughter, but she looked very much like him. Everyone present was shocked by this incident. Everyone looked intently at the second princess, who was no less shocked. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked if she could prove that she was his daughter. Cozette looked at the Duke with a smile and said that if he could give her such an opportunity, then of course she would prove it. The Duke looked at her with a grin, but said nothing. A moment later, as he left, he said that he would give her that opportunity. The only question she would like to know the answer to is what kind of person her father is. From that day on, the world she was accustomed to began to change. Cozette greeted Kier with a smile and asked if she had slept well. Cozette said with a smile that the butler showed her her new room. She was glad because she had never seen such a comfortable bed before. Cozette said with a joyful smile that the beds here were not more comfortable than her uncle's. She also wanted to know what Kira's room was like. Cozette said with a joyful smile that it would be nice to walk around the rooms after breakfast. But a moment later she accidentally spilled water on her outfit. A moment later there was a commotion as the maids hurriedly cleaned the young lady's outfit while Kira quietly sipped her tea. Cozette smiled and asked for forgiveness for causing trouble. Kira looked at the lady intently and said that she would tell the butler to assign her an etiquette teacher. Kira stood up with lightning speed and said that she was already full, so she would leave them. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said what else to prepare for her. Cozette smiled and said that the train was later, as she wanted to apologize to Kira, as she had ruined breakfast. The maids glanced sideways at each other. The young lady in turn walked slowly towards Kira, but she heard the maids saying that Kira had a high title and was difficult to get close to. They said that the young lady Cozette very much resembled the Grand Duke. At the same time, Kira was practicing fencing. She was furious because a young lady suddenly appeared out of nowhere and claimed that she was a blood relative. Kira realized that the girl's face resembled her father's, and it seemed to her that the girl was not growing up as a noble lady. Kira knew she had nothing to worry about. She was her father's biological daughter. She was a woman from the Furvis house, born with strength of spirit. She understood that it didn't matter at all what happened, because only one daughter with the gift would be born. She knew that for the entire generation, only one daughter would become the shield of salvation, while the second would be a fake that would bring chaos. Kira was very worried that the young lady might have contacted the spirit before she did. Cozette ran up to Kira with a joyful smile and said that she had picked flowers that were very beautiful. Cozette looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and asked what she was doing in the clearing alone. Kira looked at the young lady intently, knowing that the fake would die in the end. Kira sighed heavily and said that she had been training but was done. She had a short break, but she wanted to rest. She asked the young lady to go back. Cozette looked at her intently, asked why she was so unfriendly. Cozette sighed heavily and said that she only wanted them to be friends. Kira looked at the girl in surprise and said that she didn't know her at all. As she left, she sighed heavily and said irritably that she had no desire to befriend her. Cozette asked Kira, with a smirk, if it was all because she wasn't her father's real daughter. Kira looked at her, taken aback, and asked what she was talking about. Cozette, with a joyful smile, she looked at the young lady. She said that it was not her fault that she was born from her mother's connection with another man. Cozette came closer and said with a grin that even if dirty blood flowed in her veins, she was not at all guilty. Kira froze in rage for a moment. Cozette, with a fierce grin, said that it didn't bother her at all, even though she had thrown her mother out. Cozette said that after that she became a duchess and seduced her father. She told the girl that they should feel guilty because it was the mother's sin. A moment later, the young lady could not stand it any longer, and looking at the girl with fury, pointed her sword at her. Kira said with fury that if she continued to insult her mother, she would wipe the smirk off the face of the earth. They looked at each other in silence for a while. With lightning speed, the maids rushed to the young lady. They were shocked by what they saw. Cozette in turn screamed and called the maid. Kira in horror, as they did not expect such a thing from her. The maid was shocked. She did not understand how the lady could point a sword at the one who came to apologize. Cozette said that she just wanted them to be friends. Cozette, with tears in her eyes, asked forgiveness for the young lady because she could not imagine that she would react to such a thing with such rage. Cozette said that even though they were half-related, she still thought of her as a sister. Cozette said that she did not want to be hostile to her, so she would not interfere with her rest anymore. Kira, in turn, was shocked by what she heard, since she had recently insulted her mother. The maid was in shock. She shouted to the young lady that she was bleeding. Cozette quickly shouted that she was fine. The maids were shocked. They shouted that they had to call a doctor immediately. Kira froze in place, for a moment in shock. The maid looked at the young lady with fury and said that they would leave at once. As she left, Cozette looked at Kira with a grin. At the same time, the Duke was sitting in his office and thinking about everything. He remembered his beloved. She said that if they had a son, she would like to name him Christian, but if it rained, then she should be called Cozette. The lady smiled and said that she felt awkward talking about such a thing, so he shouldn't tell anyone. She wanted it to be their secret. He thought for a moment, comparing the young lady who called herself his daughter with his beloved. He was puzzled because he could not make a decision immediately. Some time later, Kira came to her father and asked if he had called her. In turn, the young lady was glad that her father called her. He looked at her intently and said that he was surprised by what had happened recently. He looked at the young lady closely and said that she pointed the sword at Cozette. Kira said that was not the case. The Duke did not listen to her and said that he understood that she was not happy about the arrival of the child. He asked if she could restrain herself and not make a scene in front of the maids. He said that, unlike her, Cozette grew up as a commoner and had no etiquette skills or knowledge of manners. Kira, in turn, shouted that the young lady had insulted her mother. After all, she said that her mother had taken a lover. Kira screamed that she could tolerate the insult directed at her, but she would never forgive the one who was defaming the name of her late mother. The Duke looked at the young lady with a cold, intent gaze and said that they would soon find out whether it was a lie or the truth. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Some time later, she returned to her room after a short conversation with her father. The madam told her daughter with a smile that it did not matter what others would say. She must know that she was Farva's the only nymph. Madam smiled tenderly at her daughter and told her to live, she was sure, as her heart desired. A moment later, the young lady couldn't take it anymore and fell to the ground with a crash. Kira knew that the one who had been acting as the Duke's daughter all this time was not Cozette, but so she did not understand why he doubted her and her mother. A moment later, the young lady came out and looked at Kira in surprise because she didn't understand what the girl was doing in the corridor at such a late hour. Kira turned around and looked at Cozette with a puzzled expression, not expecting to see her. Cozette looked at her with a grin and asked why she was crying alone. Cozette reached out to the young lady and said that she looked very pathetic right now. Kira screamed at her not to touch her, and a moment later she pushed the lady. Kira was confused. She was breathing heavily, and she was panicking. She knew she should calm down, but she was having a hard time doing it. Kira asked the lady what she was doing in the main building. Since she was not here, Cozette smiled and said that from today she lives here. Cozette said with a grin that usually the heirs live in the main building because her father had decided to do so for her, and she would now share the third floor with Kira. Kira was shocked by this statement. She looked at her with fury and asked who her father was. Kira said that she is the eldest daughter of the Farva's house. Kira screamed with cold fury at the young lady. She is not the heir of the house. Cozette laughed hysterically and told the young lady that she was quickly beginning to break down. Cosette came closer to the lady and said with a grin that she would always be there for this moment and would take back everything that belonged to her. Kira froze in shock, not knowing what to say to such words. The next day, the lady was sitting in her office when a knight knocked on her door and said that he needed to lend her some information about the situation with the enchanted beast of the north. A moment later, knights entered her office. The young man said that the evil spirit did not pose much of a threat, so a fourth squad of knights was sent there, but they asked for reinforcements. Kira asked what their plan of action was. He said that since the canyon was nearby, they decided to set up an ambush. She sighed heavily and said that this place is ancient, as are the paths. Kira said that this was one of the Emperor's treasures, and they would be in trouble if this place was destroyed. She looked at them intently and asked how high the risk was. The young man said that he was below average risk. She looked at them intently and said that in that case they should follow the plan. Sir Joseph was puzzled by her decision and decided to object. The young lady looked intently at the knight. Kira looked at him intently, not looking away. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her and would obey the order immediately. She said that they also needed to raise funds for the annual charity gala. The young man was puzzled as he saw that the tension was only growing. At the same time, the maid stood quietly at the door and listened to their conversation. A moment later, they were discussing Julia Gita, not understanding what she had done to get this position. They said that she didn't even take the entrance exams and had no right to call herself the head of the knights. From generation to generation, every child of the house, upon reaching adulthood, must occupy the post of head of the knights. Those around her understood perfectly well that the young lady did not understand such things. They knew that she would not be able to prove herself as the head of the department. In turn, the maid was indignant because it was not the lady who looked at them with a cold, arrogant face. She was furious and asked her friends how dare Fake open her mouth and say anything. She knew that, of course, there was no proof that she was actually a fake, but all the facts were there. She said that when the fact that Kira is a fake is revealed, she herself will trample the arrogant face with her own feet. Kira entered and angrily asked the maid if she would take responsibility for what she had said. The maids were taken aback. The maids, trembling with fear, asked their friend to quickly apologize to the mistress. Mina asked with disdain if she had said something wrong. Trembling with fear, the other maids begged her to stop. Kira looked at her with fury. Mina asked herself why on earth she should do this, since the lady was not the daughter of a Grand Duke. A moment later, the young lady angrily slapped the maid across the face. Kira looked at her with fury and said that she was still the lady of this house, and she had the right to punish the servant for disrespect. Kira screamed at the guards to grab her and lock her in the dungeon. Some time later, Cozette ran with lightning speed to her maid. She froze for a moment and called out to Kira, trembling with fear. Cozette was shocked and did not understand how the young lady could act like this. Kira said that she was punishing a maid who had shown disrespect to her. Cozette, in turn, said that there was no need for such cruel methods. Kira looked sideways at the young lady and said that a commoner like her had no idea about the rules of aristocrats. The maid, in turn, burst into tears, screamed and begged for salvation. Everyone present froze in shock. They were confused and could do nothing when the maid was punished. Some time later, the Duke returned to the estate. Kira greeted the Duke, but at the same time, Cozette rushed towards the Duke with tears in her eyes. Bursting into tears, she begged the Duke not to throw Mina out because she was her maid. The Duke looked at Kira with cold fury, as he was puzzled, not understanding what was happening at all. Kira glared at the Duke and said that the maid had disrespected her and she had punished her accordingly. Cozette said that her maid had made a mistake, but Kira had been cruel to her, and the maid did not deserve 1,000 strokes of the stick. The Duke looked at the lady intently and said that such a punishment could kill a man. He looked at the young lady closely and said that if she had done something like that, she must have had a good reason. Kira said that she heard an insult that she could not ignore, and she did not even want to repeat the nonsense with her mouth. Cozette, in turn, shouted that she had witnesses as maids, and they could repeat what was said. The Duke looked intently at the maids and told them to tell him everything they had heard. The maids fell to the ground with the speed of lightning and asked the Duke for forgiveness. They said that their friend said that the young lady was very cold-blooded, and also it was difficult for them to serve her. They said nothing more. Kira, in turn, was furious. With lightning speed, she turned to her father, but she saw a young lady looking at her with a smirk on her face. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and the express forces. Was everything so? Kira looked at them in surprise and said that everything was not like that. She wanted them to tell the truth. A moment later, everyone present began to whisper among themselves as they understood that the young lady was difficult to deal with. The Duke looked at the young lady with his cold fury and said that she had become a problem for their house. Kira rushed to her father and shouted that everything was wrong. She shouted that it was just an act, but the Duke did not want to listen to her and angrily hit her in the face. For a moment there was dead silence in the hall. The Duke looked angrily at the young lady and asked how long she would trouble him. Kira was taken aback as she did not expect to hear something like that. A moment later, she rushed to her father and called him, but it was all in vain. He looked at her with cold fury and told her that she should not call him that anymore, as he did not even want to hear it from her lips. As he left, he said that she would be locked outside the main house for a month, and after that she should not be seen by him. Cozette asked with a grin whether the opinion and favor of the father were already so important in this society. Cozette, with a joyful grin, said that she would like to see herself beaten, just as she had beaten the maid. A moment later, the young lady pounced on Cozette, for she knew that she was to blame for everything. Cozette asked the lady with a smirk why she was so angry. Cozette said that if she wanted to sit with her in a corner for the rest of her days, she could grab her by the hair. Some time later, the young lady quietly watched her father as he walked with Cozette while she was kept shut up. Cozette asked her father with a smile if he was free today. The Duke glanced sideways at the windows where Kira was, but a moment later he turned around. The young lady smilingly told her father that they could take a walk in the garden. Kira sighed heavily and looked into the distance. She understood that if she could prove her spiritual connection with the spirits, the fake would disappear. She knew that then her father would pay attention to her. She understood that she had to take everything back. She wanted to do everything to regain her father's favor and make everything as it was before. She understood perfectly well that she had to get her power as soon as possible. She begged all the gods because she wanted her power to manifest itself more quickly. After much pleading, she saw a bright glow. She was very happy because she was able to see the spirits. The young lady, in turn, looked at her father with a joyful smile, as she had managed to show him and everyone else her strength. She was happy and said that she could finally control the spirits. Kira froze in shock on the spot. Cozette smiled happily and said that she was very happy that Beatrice had given her her blessing on her birthday. Everyone happily congratulated the young lady on her wonderful day. Kira was shocked because she didn't understand how the young lady managed to do this. She froze in place when she heard that the people wanted to punish the fake. They said that she was planning to destroy the lands with the help of a demon. Everyone present shouted that they must lock the young lady up immediately and punish her. At the same time, the Duke looked at the young lady with despair. Kira looked at him intently, but said nothing. She hoped that he would save her. But unfortunately, the young lady was sentenced to death as a sinner who would bring chaos and destruction. That was her end. At least, everything went on as usual. One young man did not interfere in the course of history. The young lady opened her eyes in a hurry and shuddered in shock. A maid burst into the room with the speed of lightning and asked the young lady what had happened. She rushed to the young lady when she saw that she was bursting into tears and breathing heavily. Kira froze for a moment and wondered if she was alive. She was confused because she didn't understand what happened for a moment. She thought it was just a dream, but she trembled as she recalled the feeling of decapitation. She understood that it could not have been just a dream. For a moment she thought and wondered if this was her afterlife, She looked closely at the maid and asked excitedly if she too had been executed. The maid looked at her in surprise, as she did not understand what her mistress was talking about. The maid told her mistress that she must have had a nightmare, for she was tired from preparing for her brother's feast. Kira worriedly asked the maid if her brother had died too. She knew they could have killed her, but she knew he had done nothing wrong. With lightning speed, the young lady rushed to her brother, for she knew that he could not die. Zeke asked his sister if she was sure that her father would believe her. He sighed heavily and said that she was still locked in the dungeon. He looked at her with fury and shouted that she must answer him. She sighed heavily and, turning around, told him to leave her, as it would be bad if he were seen near her. He asked her to run away together because he understood that if everything continued like this, she would die. She said that in that case, he would have to become a criminal. She said that he should return, as it was all for his own good. But the young man was furious because he did not want to live with snakes. He sighed heavily and said that he would definitely come back to her, and therefore she should not sit on the floor. The young lady ran hurriedly through the castle, calling for her brother. She was shocked because she saw that all the servants were there. She knew that most of them had not done anything. She was shocked and did not understand why her father went so far. Zeke looked at his sister in surprise and called out to her. He was worried and wondered if something had happened. She looked at him intently and said that she heard that he was here. Zeke looked at her in surprise, asked if he could have gone somewhere. Zeke looked at his sister with alarm and said that if their father saw her like this, he would not like it. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was talking about her father. Kira asked worriedly if they were not in the afterlife now. Everyone present looked at the young lady in bewilderment. Zeke looked at the maid and said that it seemed that his sister was not fully awake. He asked to take her to the room. Those present looked at the young lady in bewilderment. They did not understand what had happened. She was taken aback for a moment because she saw familiar faces, but they were very young. She looked at them intently and asked what day it was. At that very hour, the young man gave her an answer to her question. She froze in place as she realized that she had returned to the past. She was confused and did not understand who did this and why. Zeke looked at his sister with confusion because he thought she was kind of weird. She sighed heavily and said that she seemed to have had a terrible nightmare, but she was not sure of her words. She sighed heavily and said that she had a dream and that she had died a terrible death. Everyone present was surprised, but at the same time supported her. She smiled and told her brother that they could have lunch together. Zeke sighed heavily and said that his sister would leave earlier because at that time she was greeting her father. She always got up early and dressed beautifully to greet her father. Now the young lady realized that she had been stupid. She was puzzled and did not understand why she was so clinging to a man who did not care about her. She knew that if she came back, she was given another chance so that she could change everything. She wanted to be with the people who cared about her. A moment later, the young lady said that from today on, she would not do anything like that. Sir Joseph was furious and shouted at the Duke that the young lady had not deceived him on purpose. He did not understand why they had decided to execute her. The Duke glanced sideways at the young lady as everyone present chanted in unison as they wanted the young lady killed. Some time later, the Duke woke up from a terrible nightmare. He froze in place in shock as he did not understand what he had dreamed. The next day, he sat in his office and looked at papers. The butler looked at the door in surprise as he noticed that the lady had not come to greet him today. The Duke looked intently at the closed door but did not answer. He asked the butler if she was ill. The butler said that a few hours ago, she was running around the mansion in her nightgown. He asked the Duke if he should know what had happened. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was not typical of her. The butler looked closely at the Duke and said that he did not look well. The butler told his master that he should rest a little. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had had a nightmare, so he was unable to rest properly. The Duke was puzzled because he did not remember what the nightmare was about, but he clearly felt the emotions from it. The sadness that would have broken his heart still left an unpleasant feeling and bitterness in his soul. He told the butler to send a doctor to the young lady. Sometime later, Kira was busy looking for the book. A moment later, she found what she was looking for. She thought for a moment as she knew that in a few months, a young lady would appear. She would be appearing in front of high society at Zeke's birthday party. She probably wanted rumors about her to spread throughout the capital. Kira froze in place for a moment as she remembered the young lady saying that she was real. Kira was confused and didn't understand what her words even meant. Kira wondered why the young lady had powers, if she was the Duke's true daughter and not Cozette. Kira sighed heavily, as she knew that thinking wouldn't help her in this situation, since she couldn't even find out why she came back. She knew she had to try to write down all the events that had happened and prepare for the future. She knew she had to escape when the time came. She wanted to remember first what she saw before she died. She understood that if she saw the spirit, she should understand how the girl was able to contact Beatrice. She also wanted to know if there was magic of returning in time. She thought for a moment, as she had never heard of such a thing before. She thought that asking the magic tower about such a thing was useless. Moments later, a maid entered her room and said that the Duke had sent her a doctor, most likely because she had not greeted him in the morning. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She understood perfectly well that when she begged him for salvation, he ignored her, but now his actions were even funny to her. Kira sighed heavily and said that she was fine, and asked the maid to send the doctor back as she did not want to waste time on useless things. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that she understood everything Kira said, that she would like to get down to business. The maid looked at her intently and asked if she was talking about the nightly order. The maid looked closely at the young lady who was leaving in a hurry and said that she would prepare clothes for her. Sometime later, the young lady was watching the knights, training closely. Joseph looked at everyone present and ordered the next one to come forward to fight. The young lady looked closely at the young knight, as she knew that he would pass all the standards. She looked closely at his fights and realized that she had lived through a day like this before. She looked intently at the young man, who greeted his friends with joy. Joseph asked in surprise how she knew he would pass the tests, even if she hadn't seen him train. She said she just heard about him. He sighed heavily and said that he had picked her up. A moment later, there was dead silence between them. The lady was not at that time on good terms with Sir Joseph, because she became the head just because she was the Duke's daughter. There was a gap between them. Unlike her, who got her position thanks to the pedigree of the deputy head, he was talented. To gain an advantage, she constantly opposed him. Now she realized that it was stupid of her, and memories suddenly came flooding back to her, and she remembered how he had fiercely defended her before her execution. She was surprised because she did not expect such a thing from his side. She knew that it was he who tried to protect her until the very end. The young lady sighed heavily and timidly called out to the young man. The young man looked at the young lady in bewilderment. She looked at him intently and said that she had something to tell him. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect this. A moment later, the young lady said she would like to apologize to him. Joseph looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what was wrong. She sheepishly said that she was jealous of him. She said that she wanted to be recognized by everyone like he was, and therefore wanted to apologize for taking his place. She looked at him intently and said that from now on there would be no arguments, and she would not quibble over trifles. Kira smiled and said that now he could lead the order flawlessly on his own, and from now on he didn't have to ask her opinion. He was shocked by what he heard, but a moment later the knight told the head of the order that the training was over. She smiled and said that they could go now. Sometime later, the young lady greeted the knights and congratulated them on joining the knightly order. She got out and said that there would be a party for newcomers soon. Joseph smiled and said that was exactly it, and let it be called a welcome party after all, and not just have a drink together. She said that they could drink and eat as much as they wanted because she would pay for everything. The knights froze for a moment because they had already imagined how everything would happen. They whispered among themselves because they understood that if the head came, they would be awkward, and the whole evening they would walk as if on thin ice. Joseph looked at them intently, and the young knights fell silent. A moment later, the young lady said that she would not come to the party. Everyone present beamed with joy. A moment later, it said that its presence would ruin the atmosphere of the party, so it apologized in advance. The knights froze in shock. A moment later, the young lady said she had no ill intentions. Kira said that she only thought that they could become closer if she was present. She didn't at all imagine that her presence could ruin their party. She said that it wouldn't happen, so she hoped they would have a good time. Joseph looked at the lady in shock. Everyone present was shocked by her words. Moments later, there was an awkward silence between everyone present. Kira, in turn, thought that they would be happy, but she did not understand why the atmosphere became so gloomy. A moment later, she said that she had some things to do, so she would leave them first. The young man looked at his friend and asked in confusion what they should do now, since it seemed their complaints had reached her ears. The young men only wanted her not to come, so as not to spoil their holiday, but now they understood that their words had offended her. They did not understand what was with her expression, and it seemed to them that she was thus ordering them to stop and disperse. They thought that she did not want them to disgrace the order and to return to their duties as soon as possible. The girl looked at all the knights and said that the lady was decent, so she did not know how to have fun. The young man was puzzled because he realized that the young lady wanted to come to get closer to them, but they simply rejected her. Joseph sighed heavily and said that he now understood why she seemed sad to him, because it was all because of them. They were puzzled and did not know what to do. Now Joseph said that he would go to her and apologize. The knights shouted to the young man that he should say that they would be happy if she came to them. The young people shouted because they hoped that the deputy would do everything possible. Some time later, the young man slowly walked towards the head. He thought for a moment because she had previously offered him her sincere apologies. Now he realized that she didn't hate him. He thought with a smile that until yesterday she had been like a rose with thorns. But today he realized that she was a completely different person. It seemed to him that today she was free. At the same time, the young lady was slowly walking towards the Duke. As she led him into the office, she told the Duke that she had come to thank him for sending a doctor to her. She looked hard at their Duke, but said nothing more. He looked at her intently and sighed heavily, saying that if that was all, then it would have been enough to simply write a letter. He said that she didn't need to come to him and waste her time. She looked at him intently and said that she would never have bothered him just for that. Kira said that she planned to stop greeting him in the mornings, starting today. The Duke froze for a moment in shock. Bowing, she said that she apologized for causing him inconvenience, as he was always busy. She looked at her father intently, because she knew that it did not matter to him whether she came or not. He shuddered at her words, but a moment later he said that she could do as she wished. She thanked him and said that she would like to ask him something. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, because he did not expect this. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to leave her position as the head of the knights for a while. Kira said her body needed rest, and she thought a few months would be enough. The Duke said that it was too long, and he would give her only 1 month. She looked at him and asked if he could give her a month and a half, but she addressed him formally as before. The Duke was taken aback and asked in surprise what she had just said. She understood perfectly well that she would have to leave this position. When Cozette appeared, she wanted to leave herself. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she was too tired, and that was why she asked for a leave. The Duke was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise, as it seemed to him that he had imagined her words, but he still said that she could take as much as she had originally asked for. A moment later, her naledi thanked him and left. The Duke, frozen in shock, felt an emptiness in his soul. The Duke turned her words over in his head for a moment, shocked that she was addressing him formally. Some time later, the young lady was sitting in her room drinking tea. She wondered what had happened since her death. She wanted to know if her father continued to live happily with his real daughter until the very end. She wanted to know if the empire had survived the foreseen disaster safely. She sadly wondered if everyone was happy after her death. A moment later, Sir Joseph entered her room. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. The young lady looked at her knight closely and said that if he had come because of what had happened earlier, then he need not worry, for she had apologized because she was truly sorry. Joseph looked closely at the young lady and said that he would like to talk about the welcoming party tonight. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. A moment later, she looked away from him. Embarrassed, she told him that he really shouldn't worry about her, and in turn, he should have a lot of fun. She looked at the young man intently and said that she might cause inconvenience if she came. A moment later, she said she would also like to step down as head for a while. Joseph was taken aback, as he was shocked by her words. He did not understand what she was saying. She said that the position was not given to her from the beginning, so she would simply give way to the one to whom it should belong. Joseph was shocked by her words. He shouted that if she was upset because of what the other guys said, then she shouldn't do that, because that doesn't mean the others don't want to be friends with her. Joseph said that the welcoming party was a place where everyone was socializing, having fun, and drinking, and if she sat there with a stern expression on her face, it was natural that people would misunderstand her. She sighed heavily and asked if the knights didn't want her to come. Joseph stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to say. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything because all the knights had passed the exams, and they had no reason to follow a man with only a name. Joseph looked at her intently and asked angrily who had told her that. Joseph said that the Duke's eldest daughter becoming the head is an old tradition, because their head will become the Duchess in the future. He did not understand who dared to say such rude words. He wanted to punish the person who said such a thing. The young lady was taken aback and asked the young man to calm down, because no one had told her this. He asked angrily if anyone had dared to threaten her. The young lady in turn looked away from him in embarrassment and said that this was not so. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently and asked if she had really made this up herself. The young lady in turn was filled with shame and blushed. He was surprised and did not understand why she suddenly had such thoughts. Joseph looked hard at the young lady and said that they never thought of her like that. He said that she was a blessing that was born only once in 100 years. She would become a duchess in the future, and they could be proud that they were leading the future of the entire continent. Joseph said that no one would doubt her after being defeated by her in training. She sighed heavily and said that all their conversations died down when she came. Joseph smiled and asked what kind of knight could talk calmly in the presence of the next duchess, who would also become the hope of the entire continent in the future. He smiled and said that she had misunderstood everything. He looked at her closely and asked her with a smile if she would fool around with the Duke around and just keep quiet. She sighed heavily and said she wouldn't do that. Kira said that she thought that loud laughter was something highly unacceptable for a noble lady. He looked at her intently and asked if she wanted to get closer to them anymore. Joseph looked at the young lady with a smile and said that everyone was waiting for her at the party. She was surprised and didn't understand why everyone was waiting for her. Joseph smiled and said that it was a welcoming party, and if she came a little later, everyone would be drunk. He looked at her intently and with a soft smile asked if she was coming with him. Kira looked at the young man as if she was enchanted. She was amazed because she did not expect such a thing. But a moment later, she decided to go with him. She froze for a moment as she replayed his words about how they all thought she was incredible. After his words, she realized something, because she thought that if she was not like her father, she would be useless. But now she realized that everything was not like that at all. Sometime later, she and her companion walked into the tavern, and everyone present was very glad to see her. A moment later, Joseph showed her the way. The young man smiled and said that now everyone was assembled and it was time for them to begin. Kira looked at them with bewilderment, as she did not understand what they were talking about. Reina looked at everyone present and said that from now on, she was a knight of House Farvis, and today she greeted everyone. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that now the recruits would show what they were capable of. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, Reina swung her sword, and a gentle light enveloped her. With lightning speed, the small glasses fell into the mugs of beer, thanks to Reina. Kira looked at everyone present with admiration and surprise. A moment later, there was a crash and a shout. Everyone present was enjoying the evening. Joseph, in turn, was surprised and puzzled because they were behaving very loudly. The young lady looked around in bewilderment and a moment later began to clap for them. The young lady froze in surprise when she saw that she and Joy were mixing different drinks. She was confused because she didn't understand what was going on at all. After some time, all those present were enjoying themselves and engaging in conversation. The young man presented the chief with a drink, with a smile, and said that she must drink it. The young lady, in turn, thanked the knight. A moment later, the young lady began to slowly sip her drink. The knight glared at the young lady and shouted that she was doing it wrong. He shouted that she should look at him carefully and do everything exactly as he did. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock as she saw the young knight greedily gulping down the drink. Kira looked at the young knight in surprise and asked if this was really a ritual of oath, trust, and friendship. The young man was taken aback, not knowing what to answer, and a moment later he said with a smile that he had simply emptied the mugs, and if there was anything left inside, it would spill on her. He smiled and handed her a mug of drink and said it was her turn. The young lady looked at the mug in surprise, wondering if she really had to drink it all at once. Everyone looked at her intently, waiting for what she would drink. A moment later, her ice drank the contents in one gulp. Everyone squealed with delight. The young men looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was incredible. In turn, they could not even imagine that she was capable of such a thing. The young lady looked at them intently and thanked them. But a moment later, she said that she was no longer their leader, so they could simplify to her in a different way. Everyone present froze for a moment. They were shocked by her statement. She smiled and timidly said that she wanted to take a break, so she apologized in advance for her absence, and she also thanked them for following her. She looked at everyone present and said with a smile that if it was possible she would like to hand over her powers to Sir Joseph. Everyone was shocked by her statement, as they did not expect such a thing. They were shocked and knew she was not hurt, and they had finally gotten along with her, but she suddenly decided to leave them. The knights hoped that she would return to them soon. They looked at her closely and said that they had never seen her rest before. They wanted her to have a good rest and return to them soon. Kira thanked them for their concern with a gentle smile and agreed. The young men were happy to say that today they should rest until dawn. They wanted to drink to their lady with joy. The young lady, in turn, also supported them. After a while, the young lady sighed heavily as she had drunk too much. A moment later, she realized that she was in Reina's embrace. She was confused because she didn't understand what had happened. She didn't understand why tears were rolling down her eyes. The knights were shocked, and with tears in their eyes, they screamed that everything happened because of the Grand Duke. They knew that he was very scary, since he never spent time with others. The young lady looked at the young men in surprise, as she did not understand what they were talking about. But a moment later she realized that they were talking about that man, and she involuntarily drooped. A moment later she could not stand their conversations, and shouted that she even fell down on purpose, crying because she wanted to attract his attention. But he did not even visit her room. The young people were furious. They did not understand how he could treat her so cruelly. They did not understand what kind of father he was at all. Reina looked at the young lady and said that everyone thought she was very kind. She said that the lady should make a rebellion against him. Kira screamed with tears in her eyes that to rise up meant to remember him, and she hated everything that was connected with her father. The young men shouted that everything was right, and time was precious, and she was old enough to relax. They shouted that she studied hard, but the time spent with them was much more fun. She looked closely at the young people, and a moment later, with a joyful smile, said that everything was right. She said that she never knew that it was possible to have fun with everyone so late. Sir Joseph looked at the young lady in surprise, for it was the first time he had seen her smile happily. Raina looked at the young lady with alarm and said that she had completely passed out. She was confused, and I didn't know what they were going to do. Joseph looked at them intently and said that he would take care of everything and take the young lady to the estate. Raina, in turn, said that she was already leaving, so he would take her. A moment later, the young man looked at Joseph and said that the young lady had had a great time, and he didn't need to sigh like that. Joseph looked at him closely and said that he was very noisy. He smiled and asked Joseph if he was embarrassed here. Moments later, Joseph hit his comrade, who fell to the ground with his scream. The young man was puzzled, not knowing what had come over him at all and why he had done such a thing. Joseph looked closely at his friend and asked what he was talking about, madam. The young man said that they talked about various things, but they also complained a little about the Duke. Joseph was taken aback by this and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that the head also complained about the Duke. He told Joseph that if the Tuns were going to punish them, then she should be punished too. The young man sighed heavily and said that he could never have imagined that their head was like that because he had previously thought that it was frightening and cruel. He said with a happy smile that it seemed she could be gentle and quite sweet. Joseph looked at the young man intently and told him to watch his language. Joseph sighed heavily, digesting the whole situation. He was puzzled and could not understand how Wilford could say that the young lady was nice. He did not understand how such thoughts could enter his head. But still, he froze for a moment and remembered the young lady. He was very embarrassed because he realized that she was very sweet at that moment. The next day, the young lady woke up with a terrible headache. She asked the maid to clear her schedule. The maid asked in surprise if she really wanted to cancel all plans because she noticed that the young lady was not feeling well. She sighed heavily and said that there were attacks. The maid looked at the young lady closely and said that she had previously asked for detailed information about the spirits. She asked if she should go to the library as well, and also wanted to know about the mistress, if she wanted to go there. Now Kira said that she would like to go to the library. Kira sighed heavily, and gathering her thoughts, called the maid. She asked Rose where she would choose to live if she had the chance. Rose smilingly said that she had been dreaming of traveling, as she had never been outside the capital before. She smilingly said that she wanted to see the world and have new experiences. Kira smilingly told the maids that she could take a vacation a little later. Kira told the maid that she would report this to the butler so that their family would cover all the expenses. The maid thanked the young lady in surprise. The young lady smiled and said that she saw that the maid was very happy, and she believed that she would not go further than the outskirts of the city. Rose smiled and said that living in a small town was a waste of time, and besides, she didn't want to die, having spent her whole life just working. Milady sighed heavily and said that everything was correct because work was not the purpose of life. Rose smiled and told her mistress that she spoke like an old man with great life experience. The young hair lady, in turn, wondered that if there was a parallel universe in which she was not a child of the Farvis house and had freedom, she knew that then her life would be completely different. She looked at the maid intently and asked how other noble ladies lived. The maid was taken aback for a moment because she did not know such a thing. She asked the mistress, what about novels in which the main characters are noble ladies? She smiled and said, mistress, that she could recommend her some books. Kira smiled and said that it sounded good, and she asked the maid to recommend books that talked about the daily life of a lady. Rose said that the young lady's preferences were different from hers, but she would pick something interesting The young lady, in turn, wanted very much to know what the world was like outside this house. Sometime later, she was sitting in the garden and reading books, but all the information was already known to her. She looked at the butler intently and asked him if he knew anything about spirits and if he had ever seen them. Robert sighed heavily and said that he had never seen them and knew that only the descendants of the Duke's house could see them. The young lady looked at him intently and asked him to investigate the reasons why an ordinary person could see spirits. Dvoretsky looked at her in surprise, but still agreed to carry out the task. She knew that if she said she was interested, it wouldn't arouse suspicion theoretically, so she had been studying all her life. She was very eager to attend parties and make friends because she had a new life. Now that she thought about it, she didn't even have any friends, and at all the parties she attended, she always stayed with her family. The young lady wondered if it was precisely at times like these that rumors spread that she was boring. A moment later, a knight approached her and said with a smile that he was looking for her. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. Wilford said with a gentle smile that he had brought her a special drink. It should help her recover from her hangover. He said with a smile that the deputy asked him to pass the drink. The young lady thanked him with a smile and said that her head did indeed hurt a little. A moment later, she noticed that the knight was leaving in a hurry. With the speed of lightning, she called to him. Wilford looked at the young lady in surprise, not understanding what she wanted. She turned around and told the maids to leave them. With lightning speed, the young lady ran up to the knight and asked if he got along well with other people. Wilford looked at her in surprise and said that she actually had a lot of acquaintances. She looked at him with a smile and said that she expected nothing less. Kira looked at the knight with shining eyes and said that he must have attended many social receptions. She smiled and said timidly that she would like to get along with someone outside of her family, but she didn't even know where to start. She looked closely at the young man and asked what she should talk about with people to get along with them. The young man sighed heavily. He wondered if she had been alone all the time. He thought for a moment and said that she would have an easier time with girls her age. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that he felt a little awkward telling her such a thing. She smiled and said that everything was fine, and he could tell her everything. Wilford looked timidly at the young lady and said that she should smile her pleasant smile more often. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. In one breath, the young man said that people like it when they have friendly conversations with them. He looked at the young lady intently and shouted that she looked very threatening when she spoke without emotion, and in that case, she looked very much like a duke. He meant that the look and eye contact also mattered, and she should not think anything like that. The young lady was shocked by her words, but in turn said that Sir Joseph had said something similar. The young man smiled and said that she did not need to worry, since the first impression was not so important, but the conversation itself was very important. He said that she needed to find common interests with the interlocutor, and he also asked what she was interested in. She thought for a moment and said that she was interested in destroying magical beasts and protecting the empire. The young man sighed heavily. He looked at her intently and asked what she thought of opera or theater. Kira thought for a moment and said that she couldn't say that she liked something like that, but she would look into something like that. She realized that in that case, she could continue the conversation. Wilford said hastily that it would be more like she was forcing herself because interests were something else. He said that it would be wrong if she forced herself to enjoy something that did not interest her at all. Wilford said with a gentle smile that she should enjoy talking about something she liked. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she had never heard anything like this before. A moment later, she sighed heavily and told the knight that he was absolutely right. She knew that if she continued to behave like this, then her behavior now would be no different from her past life. Some time later, the maid with her happy smile told the young lady that she had brought her some novels. The young lady looked closely at the book and read the title of the novel. The maid said that it was better not to read this book before going to bed. Kira looked at her in surprise, as she did not understand why she should not do something like that. Rose said the lady that she would be very interested in the story, and for this reason would sit up all night long. The young lady sighed heavily, and asked if the story was really about everyday life, because she knew that, alas, everyday life was not funny. The young lady was the daughter of a low-class nobleman. As soon as she had the opportunity, in the summer she decided to take a vacation in the capital. For this session, she had to thank her aunt, who married a very influential man. Thus she met her 18th birthday, heading to the capital. Then she met a young man on her way, who was very attractive. The young man looked at the young lady with a radiant and gentle smile, and introduced himself, and she thought that a miracle had brought her and the count together. After arriving in the capital, they spent every day together. One such fine day, the count quietly approached the young lady and gently whispered her name in her ear. Then the count's hand ended up under her dress. She timidly looked away from him and said that anyone could have visited this garden, but this did not stop the count. With lightning speed, the young lady threw the book to the ground. After reading it, she was shocked, but at the same time confused, because she did not understand what she had just read. She was in shock, did not understand what kind of books the maid had brought her. She knew that no matter how interested she was, she couldn't read something like that kind of novel. The lady looked closely at the book that was lying next to her bed. She was embarrassed, but still wanted to read another page. When the young lady found herself in the count's arms, it seemed to her that time had stopped. She knew that happiness would be eternal, and if she was always near him. Kira, in turn, did not notice how morning came, because she had been reading a fascinating novel all night. She was confused and exhausted, having not been able to sleep all night. She was shocked and wondered what she had spent the whole night doing. A moment later, a maid entered her room and told the young lady that it was time to wake up. Kira hid the book with lightning speed. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise. Rose looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this was the reason she asked not to read the novel before going to bed. She smiled and asked if she was interested. At the same time, the young lady was blushing with embarrassment. She looked away from the maid, embarrassed, and said that she had enjoyed the novel very much. She began to quote one scene from the novel. She said she liked the scene where they enjoyed the ball all night. She said she didn't know that happened before. The young lady also really liked the life of the main character at the academy, because it was also fun. Kira sighed heavily, because she knew that she had previously only studied at home, and she was happy to read something like this. Rose smiled and said, "Young lady, there are similar stories, and if she wants, she could bring them." Kira perked up after hearing these words, and said with a smile that it would be very wonderful. The young lady was shocked by her behavior because she was too carried away by such things. The maid smiled and said that it was very good, and also said that she had nothing planned in the morning, and she asked the mistress if she would like to sleep a little. The young lady smiled and said that she had planned to visit the library. Kira, in turn, sighed heavily, as she hoped that the young servant did not suspect anything. Some time later, the maid came down to her friend's room and asked where the continuation of the story, Summer Adventures of Lady Stella, was. The maid looked at her in surprise and said that the continuation was in her room. Rose looked at her friends intently and said that the lady said she wanted to read it. The maids froze in shock, as they did not expect such a thing. With lightning speed, they pounced on Rose and asked if my lady read romantic stories. They were shocked and asked if she read them, and not holy or academic books. They asked their friend if the young lady was going to have her trashy and shameful book burned. Rose sighed heavily and said that it was not so, and she simply asked to borrow the book. Rose sighed heavily and said that the young lady said that she was interested in how ordinary ladies lived. The maids thought for a moment, as they did not expect such a thing. Some time later, the young lady visited the library. She was reading a new book intently. While reading the book, she looked at it with embarrassment, as there were very piquant details in it. A moment later, she slapped herself in the face, knowing that now was not the time to be thinking about such things. She knew that she needed to find out a lot of information about spirits. Now, she sighed heavily, as she realized that this was what she should have expected after reading this book. She knew that being the only family connected to the spirits, they knew nothing about them, because the temple said that the holy power granted by the goddess should not be subject to experimentation. So she was accepted without question. She sighed heavily, as she knew that because of this, there were few material to study in the library. She was getting bored, rereading what she already knew. A moment later, she heard familiar names. The young lady quietly walked out of the library and saw the maids discussing the book she had read earlier. The maid said that the main couple rarely appeared, and the main character's younger sister appeared only towards the middle of the novel. They were surprised and did not understand why her lady was looking for such a book. They were informed that the young lady wanted to know about the life of the noble daughter, and so she studied this book. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled by what she heard. The maids whispered to each other because they liked the scene where they confessed their feelings to each other in the garden. They didn't know if it would be rude to say that this moment was exciting, but still the main characters were afraid of being caught. They also liked the scene when they went to a mansion by the sea for their wedding night. The young lady, in turn, was hiding behind the wall, listening to their conversations with embarrassment, as she also liked this scene. The maid sighed heavily and, looking intently at her friends, asked if they really enjoyed such scenes. She smiled and said that she preferred the part where the main characters recognized each other at first sight. Although they were wearing masks, the young lady, in turn, listened to the maids with admiration, as she also liked this scene. She glanced sideways at the maids, as she also wanted to join in their conversation. But a moment later, she decided to throw all thoughts away and forget about it, because she was perfectly aware of what kind of reputation she had. But she still couldn't resist and looked out from around the corner. The maid glanced sideways at the young mistress who was staring at them. A moment later, the maid screamed, not expecting to see their mistress. With lightning speed, they bowed and asked forgiveness from the young lady. She looked at them in surprise, but said nothing. The maids, taken aback, trembling with fear, said that it was their break. They begged her to believe them. The maids hurriedly shouted that they were immediately returning to work. The young lady froze in place, in shock, unable to utter a word, as the maids quickly left her. She looked after them, puzzled, as she just wanted to listen to their conversation some more. Some time later, the young lady returned to her room, in a depressed mood. She sighed heavily and wondered if she had said without hesitation that she had enjoyed this conversation, things would have been different. Kira knew that her reputation had always been her priority, and she didn't even have the courage to admit what she actually liked. Returning to her room, she accidentally bumped into her maid. Rose looked at the young lady closely and asked with a smile if she had finished her business in the library. Kira rested and said that she had not finished her business yet and planned to look for more information tomorrow. Rose looked closely at the young lady and asked how about a similar story to the one she had read earlier. The young lady looked at her maid intently and said that the truth was that everything she had said in the morning was a lie. The maid looked at her in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Kira couldn't stand it any longer and shouted that when she said she wanted to study the normal life of an ordinary lady, she lied, but it certainly helped her. She lived, sighed, and said shyly that, to be honest, the novel was very exciting, and she really enjoyed their first meeting and the confession scene. She sighed heavily and said shyly that she was embarrassed to say that she enjoyed reading the novel. Rose looked at the lady with a sweet smile and thanked her, because when the lady said that she liked the novel, she felt happy, and next time she wanted to bring her something else. Kira, in turn, felt relieved after what was said, and also thanked her maid with a smile for recommending the book to her. She really wanted to talk to everyone, and luckily when she opened up, she was given the opportunity. At the same time, the Duke was slowly getting ready for the trip. All the servants present greeted the Duke and wished him a safe journey. The Duke, in turn, glanced sideways at his daughter's window. He knew that because of the trip, he would not see her for some time. He knew that before, whenever he went somewhere, she always came to see him off. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and said that the young lady was busy, and most likely he would be able to see her later. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise and asked what she was busy with. The butler said that the young lady was currently in the library and she was studying spirits. The Duke sighed heavily as his daughter was again reading information about spirits. A few days ago, a man was sent to the church. He knew that in addition to mentioning spirits, she was also looking for evidence of their existence and appearance in public. He was surprised and at the same time puzzled because he didn't understand why she was so curious about this. He knew that since his family blood flowed through her, most likely her abilities would reveal themselves on their own. In turn, the Duke, not having time to sit down in the carriage, staggered as he suddenly felt ill. Everyone present quickly rushed to the Duke. They were very worried and asked if he was okay. The Duke sighed heavily and told his subordinates that they did not need to make a fuss because he must have just been tired. He knew that all his fatigue was connected with the recurring nightmares. At last, the Duke turned around and, looking intently at the palace, ordered to set off on a journey. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly in her room. Looking out the window, she saw the maids chatting happily with each other. She sighed heavily and wondered if she would also have the opportunity to chat casually with many people. She sighed heavily, as she knew that when she thought about such things, she felt awkward. But in turn, she understood perfectly well that Cozette never cared about such things. She smiled and told the maids that the prepared treats were very tasty and thanked them. Kira looked closely at the maids and called them. In a hurry, the maids ran away from the young lady. Kira looked at the young lady intently and said that if she wanted to officially become part of the family, she must become an elegant noblewoman. Cozette looked at the lady with a smirk and asked if she was really serious about becoming a bore. Cozette walked closer to the young lady and said that it was stupid of her. Kira froze in shock for a moment. Cozette looked at the young lady with a haughty smile and said that if she continued in the same spirit, then in the end, only she would be left alone. Kira saw that everyone was surrounding Cozette because of her kind nature and beautiful smile. Kira wondered anxiously what was so important about the status of nobles. She was puzzled because she knew that all this time she was the only one who was wrong. A moment later, a maid came into the room and asked the young lady if she had finished reading the letters. Kira smiled and told the maid that she still had a little bit left, but she would finish it quickly. At the same time, the young lady was writing to her maternal grandfather, as she had some urgent business to attend to. Marquis Simon Edinburgh was a very greedy and cruel man who used Zeke and her to strengthen his authority. But despite all this, he was very smart and never ignored her letters. She knew that since the events of the present could unfold in accordance with her dream, she needed someone who could help her. She knew that it was almost impossible to find someone within the family without escaping the Duke's gaze, so she wanted to look outside the family. She wanted to start by contacting her mother's family at the beginning of the banquet reception. She knew that all she had to do was send the letter given to her. She slowly handed the letter to the maid and with a smile asked her to make sure that the letter would be delivered personally into the hands of her grandfather. The maid smiled and said, "Madam," that she could have no doubt. The young lady knew that all that was left for her to do now was to find out what banquets her grandfather had attended and would attend. She asked the maid to bring her all the invitations that had been sent to her. The maid looked at the young lady with delight and asked if she was really going to the banquet. The young lady looked at her maid with bewilderment and asked why she was so happy. Rose smiled and said that of course she would be happy, because it would be the first time the young lady would go to a banquet alone. The maid smiled and told the young lady that no one ever knows when a fateful encounter like the main characters might happen. The young lady with a smile said it was true. The maid with a radiant smile and said that dancing together under the beautiful chandeliers, it was a breathtaking sight. The young lady looked at the maid with animation and asked where the invitation was, for she wanted to accept them immediately. The young lady looked at the butler in surprise and asked why he got rid of them. The Duke, passing by the office, involuntarily overheard their conversation. The butler asked the young lady for forgiveness because she had always declined all invitations before, and he thought that this time it would be the same. He asked her for forgiveness again. The Duke entered the room and asked in surprise what was going on. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the butler had gotten rid of the invitations that were intended for her. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she really meant to say that she had planned to accept them. She sighed heavily and said that that was exactly it. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that from its very foundation, the family had always maintained neutrality. He said that they were a family blessed by the gods, and she should know that they could not afford to get involved in useless political conflicts. He did not understand what she was thinking. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had not thought about anything serious, and she had only done it because she was tired of sitting at home. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. The maid cried out in alarm and called the young lady. Kira looked at the Duke intently and said that being here was depressing to her. A moment later, she asked the Duke for forgiveness, as she realized that she had said too much. She sighed heavily and said that the words she had been holding back had slipped out unintentionally. Everyone froze in place, in shock, as they had not expected such a thing. The Duke sighed heavily and told his daughter that if she started communicating with other noble families, many rumors would surface. He said that he wanted to know in advance what she was planning to do. The young lady, in turn, knew that everything was correct, and that he was the kind of person who cared only about the family's reputation and his duties and obligations. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she was already of a suitable age for marriage. She asked her father if it was time to look for a suitable husband. Everyone present froze in shock, as they did not expect to hear anything like this from the young lady. She sighed heavily and said that everything was correct, and she was now talking about marriage. She looked away from the Duke in embarrassment and said that he was saying that she would get married. She was just using it as an excuse. The maids were shocked because they saw that their mistress was embarrassed. Everyone present wondered if she really agreed to the marriage. The maids were surprised because they didn't know that she liked anyone. The Duke sighed heavily and asked why she wanted to go beyond the pale, using such an excuse. Kira looked at the Duke intently and said that she should be curious. She asked the Duke if he cared about what she did, as long as it didn't cause problems for the family. For a moment there was a dead silence in the room, and the Duke in turn froze in shock as he did not expect to hear anything like this. A moment later the Duke turned and told the young lady to stop talking like that, and they would talk about it when her excuse failed. As he left, the Duke stopped and looked intently at his daughter. He sighed heavily and told the butler to report to him about all the events the young lady attended and all the people she met. He wanted to know about all her actions. The next day, the young lady was inundated with letters. She looked closely at the letter, for she knew that it must reach her maternal grandfather. She assumed that the banquet at the Franks' house would be very good. A moment later, the young lady looked back and saw knights through the window. With the speed of lightning, she ran out into the street and called the knights with a joyful smile. They looked at her closely and greeted her with a smile. Joseph smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and he also asked if she had had a good holiday. Kira smiled and said that she had a lot of fun on her vacation and that she seemed to have developed new interests. Joseph smiled and congratulated her and also asked if he could find out what new interests she had developed. The young lady said with an embarrassed smile that it was a secret. The young men looked at her in surprise, as they did not know what kind of hobby she had, which she kept secret. Kira sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to admit that she enjoyed this interest because she thought it was something vulgar. She was sure that she wouldn't like it at all. Wilford, he came back and said that he knew what it was like because he had similar hobbies. She was surprised, looked at him and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that he was playing at the casino. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback as she did not expect such a thing. Wilford smiled and said that he was very nervous at first, but it turned out to be a very funny and enjoyable activity. She looked at him in surprise and asked if the others knew about it. Joseph sighed heavily and said that his knight was not hiding anything. Wilford smiled puzzledly and said that it was not illegal. The young lady in turn thought so, but still it was too much for her. Wilford looked at the young lady with a happy smile and asked if she would like to go to the casino with him on the weekend. She was surprised, looked at him, and said that she doesn't go to such places. She thought for a moment because she knew that if she refused right now, then this was the earlier feeling of a knight, because he invited her, because he wanted to share his interests with her. A moment later, the young lady timidly agreed to go with him. Joseph, in turn, froze in shock on the spot, as he did not expect such a thing from the young lady. Joseph looked hard at the young lady, and alarmed shouted that she should not force herself. She looked away from them and said sheepishly that it was not so, and she really wanted to go because it was her chance to get closer to the knights. Wilford was touched by her words and actions. Joseph looked at the young lady with determination and said that he would definitely take responsibility for her safety. Wilford looked at his friend in surprise and asked if he would also go with them. The young man was surprised, as his friend had said that he hated such places. Joseph looked at his friend in confusion and told him to shut his mouth. The young man looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said that they would see each other at the weekend. Kira looked at her comrades with a joyful smile. Sometime later, the young lady was left alone. She was shocked that she had agreed to go with them herself. She was shocked because her life was now filled with alcoholic drinks, immoral affairs, and gambling. But in turn, she knew that this was not a vice, and she was simply entering a new world, which she could not do in the past. She said she would go to the casino and just look around instead of playing for large sums of money. She knew everything would be fine. A moment later, she was taken aback as Joseph came closer to her and called out. She looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to see him again. Getting up from the ground, the young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if something had happened. A moment later, the young man handed her the herbal elixir, and he also apologized for giving her something to drink that day. The young lady accepted the gift with a smile and said that she would certainly drink it. She said that she felt very embarrassed because she had overdone it with alcohol. And unfortunately, she could not remember what happened next, but she was told that he took care of everything. She looked at the knight with a smile and thanked him. Joseph smiled and said that he was very glad that she enjoyed the party. He smiled tenderly back at her and said that the other knights were also happy to have spent time with her. Joseph looked closely at the lady he had found and sheepishly said that that was why that evening had been wonderful. Kira froze in place for a moment in surprise, as she didn't expect to hear anything like that. But a moment later, her expression changed, and with a joyful smile, she said that everything was exactly like that. She looked at the knight intently and asked him with a smile to take care of her again. Sometime later, the young lady greeted Viscountess Shore. Kira looked at the Viscountess intently and said that she heard that her father asked for her help due to her inexperience in organizing banquets. Kira, with a soft smile, said that although she lacked experience, she would do her best to learn. The Viscountess smiled and said that the deadline was already close, but she would still be able to complete the preparations on time. The young lady thanked the madam with a smile and also asked her to take care of her. Kira was well aware that there was not much time left before Cozette appeared. She was going to learn more about time travel magic, but because of yesterday, her father had definitely increased his surveillance of her actions. She understood perfectly well that it would be difficult for her to send a person to the magic tower unnoticed. She was puzzled because she did not know what to do. The young lady asked for forgiveness from the madam, because due to her first experience, she now had a lot of thoughts in her head. Madame sighed heavily and said that the young lady had little experience in high society. She said that her son tried his best to avoid social events, and this worried her. She didn't understand what was so interesting about the wonderful magic that he sat in the magic tower all day long. She knew that her son was very good at magic. The young lady in turn froze for a moment, but after Madame's words, a good thought struck her. She smiled and said that it was just a wonderful coincidence, because she was also interested in magic. Kira said with a smile that after hearing the Madame's words, she wanted to meet the young man. The Viscountess was surprised, and with a joyful smile, told the young lady that she would arrange a meeting later. The young lady thanked the Viscountess with a smile. Kira was glad that her question had resolved itself. She knew that it was very good, because she had no connections with the magic tower before. She had heard before that it was very difficult to learn spatial time magic from the Madame's words. She understood that the young man was a very talented magician. The young lady in turn had many expectations for the young man. A moment later, the maid called the young lady. Kira looked at the maid in surprise and asked if something had happened. The maid, trembling with fear, mumbled because she did not know how to talk to her mistress. But a moment later the maid said that Rose said to personally give her this book. Kira looked at the maid closely as she realized that she was Emily. The maid flinched when the young lady called her name. The maids glanced sideways at the young lady. Kira looked closely at the maids and asked with a smirk if they needed to hurry. The maids hesitated and looked intently at the young lady. Kira glanced sideways at the maids and wondered if this might be her chance to make friends. The young lady looked at the maids and said that she would like to hear what the book was about before she began to read it. The maids looked at the young woman in surprise, but still agreed to have a conversation with her. They said that this story is about a simple maid who met a prince. On her way later, she reached the position of empress. The young lady was surprised because she did not know if this was possible. The maid smiled and said that it was because it was just a romance. The maid smiled and told the young lady that she was probably glad. They smiled and said that they would very much like her to meet a handsome man. On her way, they did not say that if he was their mistress, then she could choose who she wanted to date. It was said that the greatest concern of any noblewoman was to find a good husband, because high society was a place to find partners. The young lady thought for a moment, because she never thought about romance. In turn, the young lady also wanted to be with someone like the Count. She was momentarily embarrassed and froze in place by her thoughts. She looked at the maids closely and said that they were right. The maids looked at the young lady in surprise, as they did not expect to see her from such a side. The maid, having relaxed a little, looked at the young lady and asked if she was really thinking about going to a ball or having tea. The young lady smiled and said that this was possible. The maids were surprised, but at the same time happy. They said that the head maid would definitely help her with the preparations. They said they would like to see the young lady's evening dress and jewelry. She smiled and told the maids that they would all help her, personal maid, prepare her outfit for the day. They were surprised and happily asked if it was true. She smiled and said that it was. They happily thanked her for such an opportunity. The young lady looked at the maids with a smile, as she knew that it was her success that she was able to talk to them. She realized that the atmosphere had improved and was different from before. She wondered if they had managed to get a little closer, and in turn, she hoped that the party would be just as successful. The maids looked at the young lady with alarm and asked what would happen if she were a lady without a gentleman. The maid said that she had read about it in a book she had borrowed, and that there were so many lonely gentlemen standing in the corner of the ballroom. But she still said that there was no need to worry about it, because there would be plenty of people who would want to talk to her. The young lady looked at them in surprise and said that she would go alone. They were surprised, looked at her, asked if she would not go with a partner. Kira, in turn, was taken aback because she had completely forgotten about it. They asked if she would like to go with the Duke. As always, the young lady categorically replied that she did not want to, as he would not fit into her schedule. The maid asked the young lady, "How about asking one of the knights?" The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was not close enough to them to ask for such a thing. The maid smiled and said that she could already imagine several knights who would be sad to hear such a thing from her. A moment later, Sir Joseph entered the room, looked at the young lady with a gentle smile, and said that he had come to see her off with his catch. Wilford greeted the young lady with a joyful smile, and said that they had also come to see her. She turned and looked closely at her companions with a joyful smile. A moment later the maid called out and called the young lady, and said that she had brought the hat she had asked for. Rose looked at the young lady excitedly, and asked where they were going. The young lady smiled, and said that they were just going somewhere for a short while. The young lady turned around, and said with a gentle smile that she was already leaving. She sighed heavily, and wondered if she was really going to the casino. Now the young lady knew perfectly well that she could not miss such an opportunity. She was glad that now for the first time there were no servants around her. A moment later, she froze, as she heard her brother's voice. He looked at her in surprise, and asked where she was going. She froze for a moment, as she did not expect to see her brother at all. He looked at her in surprise, and asked who gave her permission to leave at such a time of day. He wanted to know where she was going. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer him. Zeke looked at her closely, and with sparkling eyes, said that she looked great. She looked at her brother, as she felt that he was feeling lonely sitting at home all day. But still the young lady knew that she couldn't take him to the casino. But she knew that everything would be fine there, and she could do something like that. She looked at her brother with a smile, and said that she would go out for a while, and also asked if he wanted to come with them. Zeke looked at his sister with joy, and asked if it was true. He smiled and said that he would quickly grab his coat and come running. With the speed of lightning, the young man ran for his things. The young man was surprised, and at the same time puzzled, because he did not expect that his sister was heading to the casino. He looked at everyone present with fury, and asked if they had gone crazy. He didn't understand what they were thinking when they decided to drag his sister to the casino. Kira looked at her brother with a smile, and said that this casino was legal and even approved by the Imperial Palace. She smiled, and said that they would not be betting money, just looking around the circle, and it was all for the sake of exploring the outside world. The young people looked at the brother and sister with sweet smiles, as they looked very cute. Wilford said with a happy smile that they could have some fun soon. Zeke looked at the knight in surprise, and asked if he was the one who said that they would just look around. He smiled and said that they could only look around. A moment later, Zeke struck the knight in the leg, and the knight, with tears in his eyes, told his master that he had hit him where it hurt most. The young lady looked at everyone present with a sweet smile on her face, as she was having a lot of fun with them at that time. Some time later, they arrived at the casino. Raina looked closely at the young lady, and asked with a smile if she liked the area. She was surprised, looked around, and said that the building was cleaner than she thought. Joseph looked closely at the young lady, and said that if she was uncomfortable, he could take her to the VIP lounge. The young lady looked into the distance, and said with a smile that there was no need to do that, as she was comfortable here. Wilford looked at the young master, and said that today he would try his luck. Joseph said that whenever a knight comes to the casino, he first plays roulette. Zeke looked at the knight intently, and teased him, telling him to stop. Wilford looked at the gentleman with an innocent smile, and asked why he didn't want to play. The young man shouted that there were people who could not stop spending their money, and they would soon go bankrupt, so they needed to control themselves and not waste time on stupid things. The young lady in turn looked sideways into the distance and froze for a moment. A moment later she said with a joyful smile that she wanted to try. The young man was surprised, and at the same time puzzled by his sister's action. Wilford looked at the young lady closely, and gave her a brief outline of the rules, and he also said that the dealer had to spin the wheel during the game. She realized that winning was only possible by pure chance. Zeke looked at his sister worriedly, and asked if she was really going to play such games. The young lady said that she had gone too far, and could not leave empty-handed. A moment later, the young lady placed her bet, and the dealer began to spin the wheel. Everyone present froze in surprise, as the young lady won the game. The young lady in turn looked at her winnings with delight and surprise, As she realized that it was very funny, she looked at her brother closely and asked him with a happy smile if he wanted to try. He was shocked, as he didn't expect that. She smiled and handed him some chips for his first time. But she said that if he didn't want to play, before he could just exchange them. A moment later, the young lady said with a happy smile that she would like to play other games too. With lightning speed, she rushed into the hall. Zeke and Joseph were alarmed by her behavior. The young men only looked at each other with a joyful grin, and a moment later they called out to the young lady to wait for them. Raina looked at the young lady with a happy smile and said that it seemed like beginner's luck. She asked the lady when she exchanged the chips for money what she would spend it on. Joseph looked closely at the young lady and said that she should not be fooled, because in this way they wanted to eat at her expense. The young lady, in turn, froze for a moment, for she knew that it had been fun, and she would like to come to the casino again with everyone. She smiled and said that she agreed, because it was already late, and they could all eat together. Raina smiled and asked the lady if they could eat expensive delicacies. Wilford frowned for a moment. Zeke looked at him in surprise and asked why he looked so serious. Now Wilford said that it seemed like the young lady was lucky, but everything seemed to be very good and was too suspicious to just ignore. He looked intently at the young lady and began to speak, but a moment later a young man approached them and said that the Count had given her a message, and he also asked if she wished to read it. Joseph looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what was written on the note. The lady said that the Count asked if she wanted to play larger games. Wilford couldn't stand it any longer and shouted that this situation was definitely suspicious. The young lady said with a grin that it was very interesting. She looked at everyone present with enthusiasm and said that it looked like a knight's battle. She handed over a note and said that she was asking for forgiveness, but she did not plan to leave a huge amount of money, so she was returning home. She looked at the young man with a grin and asked him to tell the Count that she was only ready to play small games. The young man looked askance at the young lady. He looked at her intently with a smirk on his face, as she seemed to him to be a very interesting person. Joseph looked at the young lady with concern, for he was worried. She smiled and said that he need not worry, for she would be betting modest amounts, not huge amounts, and since they needed enough money for food, she could not bet all her money and lose it. She really wanted to give them as much good food as possible. Kira took a few chips and wondered if what she took would be enough. Raina looked at the young lady in surprise and asked with a smile if she was really going to buy them food with the money she won. The young lady smiled and said that was not true. She would put what she took and spend the rest on food. Raina was shocked by her statement. The young lady looked at the knight in surprise and asked if there was any problem. They looked at the young lady in surprise and wondered if they were really going to eat gold dust, since the amount was huge. The man looked intently at the visitors and said with a smile that he would take them to the Count. The young lady looked at her friends with a smile and slowly followed the young man. A moment later, they walked over to the Count, who greeted them with a smile. The man looked closely at the young lady and asked if this was her first time in a casino. The Count smiled and said that he had been watching her and that she seemed to be very lucky. The man smiled and told the Count that now he had to worry about it. The Count smiled and said that the flower of the casino was poker. He asked the young lady if she would like to play another game. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know much about it, so he could do as he wanted. The Count smiled and said that since it was the first game, he would not bet. She smiled and said that she would do the same as he did. A moment later, the cards were dealt to them, and the young lady looked closely at hers. The Count looked at the young lady with a sly smile and said that he had a straight. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what he was talking about. The young men looked at the young lady in surprise and shouted with delight that she had a full house. She froze for a moment as she did not understand what they were talking about. The young man looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she really had good luck. Kira was confused as she didn't understand how she won. The Count looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that it turned out he shouldn't be soft on her just because she was a young lady. A moment later, the Count said with joy and a grin that this time he had won. He looked at her intently and said he was very sorry, but he didn't know what she could do. He looked at the young lady intently. She froze for a moment as she felt that he was a strong opponent. The young men looked at each other as they understood that their mistress had just started playing and had won a huge amount of money, but the Count wanted to give it back. But they could not help but say something since they saw that she really enjoyed the game. The young lady, in turn, knew that she had already used all the chips she had taken and had to retreat, but a moment later she was taken aback as she saw the Count had cards up his sleeve. She knew that even though she was new to the casino, she didn't want to let the Count fool her with such an obvious scam. A moment later she screamed, but froze in place. The man grabbed the Count with lightning speed. He was furious and did not understand how the Count dared to fool the fragile lady. He screamed that he simply could not stand by and do nothing. He shouted angrily at the guard to take the swindler away immediately. The young lady froze in place for a moment as she was shocked by everything that was happening. The young man slowly approached the young lady and, taking her hand, kissed it. He said with a smile that he must have scared her while calling her a beautiful lady. Kira froze in place in embarrassment and a moment later timidly said that she was fine. She was shocked because a scene from the fatal novel flashed before her eyes because there was a similar meeting of the main characters. She looked at the young man intently and with embarrassment, for it seemed to her that he was like a count from a novel. She looked at the young man with embarrassment and thanked him for his help. Zeke looked at his sister with concern and said that it was getting late and they had to go home. Joseph told the young lady that he would get the crew ready. The young man looked at the young lady with a beaming smile and said that it must be destiny. He also asked if she would like to share a cup of tea with him. She looked at him in surprise, but still agreed, and said that she could stay for a while. She noticed that he was very handsome. He smiled and said that the beautiful lady's fighters were an honor, and it didn't matter to him how long their meeting would last. As she was leaving, the young lady told her friends that she would be back soon and asked them to wait a little. The young people froze in shock as they did not expect such a thing from the lady. Zeke asked, with cold fury, whose idea it was to drag his sister to the casino. Wilford said, puzzled, that he had not expected the young lady to agree to go with them so quickly. With lightning speed, everyone rushed at the young man. They shouted that it was his fault and he must be held responsible. Zeke screamed that he couldn't give his sister to the suspicious young man. The young lady, in turn, followed the young man with embarrassment, as she saw that he was a very cool gentleman. Some time later, the young people were sitting at a table and chatting pleasantly. The young man looked intently at the young lady and asked if she would mind taking off her hat. She looked at the young man with embarrassment and agreed with him. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was really beautiful, and he was enchanted by her beauty. He looked at the young beautiful lady with a smile and introduced himself, saying that his name was Aiden Castro. Kira looked closely at the young man and introduced herself with embarrassment, but accidentally mispronounced her name. Some time ago, the young men stood at the entrance and closely watched the guests. They noticed that the young lady was in such a place for the first time, as she was closely examining the casino. The young man said with a grin that she was nice, but she behaved like a country girl, and that she must have been brought up in a strict family. Aiden said with a sly smile that such girls are much funnier than those who know a lot. Aiden knew very well that instead of flirting, he should gradually get closer to her, because this method would work better. Following his cunning plan, he was able to win the young lady's favor. Now he sat and watched the young lady with a grin, as he was glad that everything was going according to his plan. He apologized to the young lady with a smile, as he was just nervous, knowing that someone so beautiful was next to him. Kira looked away from the young man as she was confused by his words. He looked at her with a smirk, as he realized that her affection would be easy to win. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she would like to have lunch with him this weekend. The young lady's expression changed with lightning speed and she agreed with a smile. Her companions watched her closely. Reina looked closely at the young man, as she remembered that he was a trash, and it now seemed no wonder that he seemed familiar to her. She said he was the third or fourth son of a certain viscount. She said that because he tried to hit on every girl he saw, he had a terrible reputation. Zeke was furious. He didn't want to give his sister to such a scoundrel. Reina stopped the young master, as she didn't want unnecessary noise. A moment later, she called out that the young lady was returning to them. Zeke looked at his sister with concern and intently, and asked if that bastard had done something indecent to her. She looked at her brother in surprise and said that he had only wiped off the peeling from her. Joseph looked at the young lady closely and started a conversation about her real name. She said that she did not tell him her name because she did not want her new friend to treat her well only because of her family. Everyone present looked at the young lady in shock as she called the young man her friend. She said sheepishly that he was a very nice gentleman, and she wondered if their weekend would be fun. The young people froze in shock as they had not expected anything like this at all. She was able to meet one while looking for a partner for a party. Kira was glad that she was able to meet the young man because she understood that this was destiny. She wanted to date a handsome man like him and have a good relationship, like in the novels she had read before. The maid looked at her mistress and asked with a smile if something good had happened today. She smiled and said that she had met someone nice and amazing. Rose looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what kind of person he was. The lady smiled and said that he was very handsome. Rose looked at the young lady with concern and worry and asked if that was all. Kira looked at the maid with a smile and told her not to worry because he didn't know what family she was from, and she even hid her name. She smiled and said that she was trying to act like the daughter of a poor nobleman and the countryside. Kira looked at the maid in surprise and asked why she had such a strange expression on her face. The maid sighed heavily and said that nothing terrible had happened. She knew that the lady grew up in a very rich family, and it would be difficult for her to pretend to be poor. The young lady smiled and said that she had to dine with him both weekends, and she didn't think she could just leave after eating. She smiled and asked the maid what she should do. She smiled and asked if it would be okay to rent the theater for one day. The maid looked at the young lady with alarm and sighed heavily, saying that the poor nobleman would not have had enough money to rent the entire theater. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked what normal people do when they arrange a meeting. Rose said that couples who don't have enough money usually ride carriages or airships to see the capital commoners also use this transportation. She told the lady that it might be inconvenient for her and asked if she really agreed with it. The young lady smiled and told her maid not to worry, as she had even been to a public bar and was able to drink their low-quality alcohol. She thought for a moment, as she knew that a date in the air was very romantic. She knew it would be crowded, and it would be better if they could ride just the two of them. She thought for a moment and realized that she should rent the airship for the whole day. The young lady, with a joyful smile, imagined the day when they would see each other. The maid looked at her mistress with concern, as she was very worried about her, but still she saw the young lady's radiant smile, and that was enough for her. The next day, the maid looked at the young lady in surprise and called her in a daze. The young lady, in turn, did not hear anything and continued to admire the flowers. She wondered, confused, if this was love. A moment later, Joseph walked slowly towards the young lady and called her name. He looked at the beautiful young lady in surprise, as she was glowing with beauty. Kira turned around with a joyful smile and called out to the knight. He looked at her in surprise, as looking from behind, he mistook her for another person. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really going somewhere. She smiled and said that she wasn't going anywhere. She was just in a good mood today. A moment later, she took the flower that was in her hair and gently pinned it to the knight's suit. She said with a smile that he should accept it, as the flower had a wonderful scent. Kira, with a joyful smile leaving, said that the flower suited him very well, and also asked for forgiveness. She said that it was time for her to go. The young man, in turn, froze in shock, as he did not expect anything like this. A moment later, the knights approached Joseph. They were shocked and did not understand what they had just seen. They wondered if this was really their mistress. They were surprised and did not understand what changes had taken place in her heart, because she literally became a completely different person. They wondered in unison if she had found a lover. Joseph glared at his subordinate and told him not to spread the unconfirmed rumors so carelessly. William apologized for such words. Raina, in turn, thought for a moment about what happened earlier. She looked at everyone present and said that she was very interested in how much fun her date would be. Joseph told his subordinate that she had previously spoken badly about the young man because she herself had said that he had a reputation as a womanizer. She said it was all true, and she heard that if a young lady wanted to avoid a bad stigma before her wedding, she shouldn't get involved with such trash. For a moment there was dead silence between them. They were taken aback because they knew that they had to prevent such meetings, no matter what they wanted to know, the time and place where their meeting would take place. Sometime later, the young lady came to her date. Earlier, the maid said, "Young lady," that poor noble ladies do not wear expensive clothes and jewelry. The young lady sighed heavily and drooped because she wanted to be the most beautiful for her partner. A moment later, she heard her friend's voice. He looked at her intently, as if he knew she had heard him. The young lady turned around and looked at the young man with a radiant smile. With the speed of lightning, she flew to him, and with a smile asked how long he had been waiting for her. Aiden was taken aback and looked at her in surprise, as he was confused because he was ready to swear that she was further than him. But the young lady, in turn, did not answer anything because she used the manna of travel. He wondered if he had been taking too many drugs lately, and his hallucinations were still going strong. He smiled and said that he hadn't been waiting long for her since he had just arrived. He looked at the young lady with a smile and asked what it mattered. Even if he had waited for her for a long time, he slowly took her hand and kissed it tenderly. Aiden looked at the young lady with a beaming smile and said that it was a pleasure for a gentleman to wait for such a beautiful lady like her. The young lady, in turn, froze in place with embarrassment, as she did not expect anything like this. They stood by the fountain for a while, looking at each other. At the same time, spectators were watching them closely. Wilford looked closely at the young men and asked his comrades if he should pin down the young man. Zeke looked at the young man with a sinister expression and said that they had to get rid of him carefully. Raina, in turn, sighed heavily and said that they couldn't do that. Zeke looked at the young men closely and asked if they had any better ideas. The girl said that the fastest way to show that he is trash to their lady. For example, if she remains a witness to the scene where he flirts with another woman. Zeke sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, they couldn't control that. Zeke said firmly that as he thought they needed to remove him before Sister got attached to him. Lady looked closely at her master and asked him to calm down a little. Wilford shouted that they were heading toward the restaurant. Joseph stood up with lightning speed and said that they had to hurry because they had to follow the young men. He shouted that they must under no circumstances allow that man to attack their lady. They shouted that they would definitely protect their mistress. After a while, the young people watched the couple closely. Aiden looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this was the most popular restaurant in the capital, and it was difficult to reserve a table. He said with a satisfied smile that he had heard there were many dishes here that she would not find anywhere else. The young lady looked at the young man intently, but said nothing. She remembered that the maid had advised her to praise the young man. In turn, she slowly began her meal. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said tensely that the dish was very tasty and that it was the first time she had had something like this. The young man looked at her with puzzlement, but did not answer, as he was surprised by her reaction. Aiden looked at the young lady with a timid smile and asked if that was really the case, since she didn't seem happy. The young lady coldly replied that that was exactly the case. She looked at the young man intently and asked when else she could visit a place like this. Aiden looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression, as he found her behavior very suspicious. When he met her at the casino, she looked like a country bumpkin who had just come to the capital for the first time, and it was impossible for him to imagine that she lived in special wealth. But in turn, he wondered why her behavior and attitude towards commoners seemed so natural. He looked closely at the young lady, and as he wondered who she really was, Kira looked away from the young man and asked the following Wednesday if he could spare some of his time for her. The young man smiled and said that unfortunately he had plans for that day because he already had to take care of another girl. He looked at the young lady intently and said with a gentle smile that he had a book meeting with old friends, so he couldn't postpone it, but he still wanted to meet her again. Next time Kira looked at him intently and said that if he already had plans, then there was nothing to be done about it. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that today was hers alone. A moment later he gently touched her hand and with a smile asked if there was a place she would like to visit after the meal. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said with a joyful smile that she would like to inspect such an egg on the airship. The young man, in turn, was not eager to do such a thing. He smiled and said that they had a certain schedule, and besides, the station was far from the restaurant. Kira looked at him with a happy smile and said that she told them to pick them up, so everything was okay. The young man was taken aback by surprise and asked what she was talking about. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was very funny. She smiled and said that she was not joking because she had already rented it. A moment later they heard a noise outside the window. The young lady said with a smile that they had arrived a little earlier than she expected. The young man froze in surprise for a moment. She smiled and said that she thought that the road to the station would be quite long, so she invited them here. The young man was shocked by everything that was happening because he did not expect this. Kira, with a joyful smile, pulled the young man towards her and asked if he was coming with her. Aiden was shocked and did not understand what was going on at all. He was puzzled because he knew that at first her manners seemed very unusual to him. But now she had ordered an entire airship. He was puzzled and did not understand how much money was needed to rent a royal airship. He knew that a simple nobleman could not rent an airship. He wondered if she belonged to the Imperial family. The young lady looked at her companion intently and asked with a smile if everything was all right. He was taken aback and threw his thoughts away. She smiled and said that if he was worried about the other people and their flight, he shouldn't worry, because they were told that the airship would be temporarily undergoing repairs. The young man looked at the young lady with puzzlement and wondered how influential she had to be to say such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was feeling unwell because she noticed that he had turned pale. Aiden was taken aback and said with a smile that he hadn't climbed so high for a long time, so he was a little scared. Kira looked at the young man with a gentle smile. As she saw that he was very cute, she smiled and said that he didn't need to worry, because if something dangerous happened, she would protect him. He smiled and agreed with her. He understood that no matter how he had to get away from her. At the same time, the young people were watching the couple closely. It was the first time they saw both young ladies smiling like that. Joseph looked at the young lady in surprise and intently, as it was the first time he had seen her from such a side. At the same time, Kira did not notice anyone around and was happy about the date. Joseph was furious. He didn't understand what was happening and why he felt such feelings. Raina screamed that she couldn't take it anymore, so they all had to get together. She looked at the young men closely and told them to listen carefully, as next week at the banquet, they must make sure that the lady saw the whole nature of the young man, as he would certainly flirt with other women given his nature. They spent some time planning their course of action. Joseph looked at the young men closely and said that he would certainly do everything. Raina looked at the young men closely and said that they must successfully complete the plan no matter what. Some time later, the young lady was leisurely returning home. She was a little upset because her companion said that he had plans, and so she could not go with him to the event. She wondered if she would have to go to the banquet alone. Joseph walked slowly up to the young lady and asked with a gentle smile if she had arrived safely. She looked at the young man with a smile and said that she had arrived safely and that today had been a very good day. Joseph looked at the young lady intently. He began to speak timidly, as he was very nervous. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she saw that he wanted to say something. A moment later, the young man was overcome with embarrassment and froze for a moment. Plucking up his courage, he looked at her closely and asked if she would go to the Marquise's party with him. Joseph looked away from the young lady and wondered if he had been too confident. Kira grabbed the young man's hand with lightning speed and asked if this was true. She looked at him intently and asked if he would take his words back. Joseph froze in place for a moment. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he didn't answer. She wanted to know if he was joking. Joseph looked at the young lady intently and said that of course he wasn't joking. He looked at her intently and said that he was surprised because he did not expect her to agree without hesitation. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if she had really had to pretend to think about it. Now she realized that she had agreed, as if she had been waiting for his proposal. She looked closely at the young man, as she did not understand why his face had suddenly turned so red. A moment later, she was taken aback and realized that she was holding his hands, and with lightning speed, she let go of him. She looked away from him sheepishly and said that she was in a difficult position because her partner already had plans, so due to the circumstances, she agreed. The young man sighed heavily and said that he understood her. The young lady asked for forgiveness and said that it was time for her to run away. As she ran away, she was filled with embarrassment as she was ashamed of her actions. Joseph looked closely after the young lady. He was surprised because the young lady had just smiled radiantly at him. The surprise he felt at the night's entrance exams was nothing compared to what was happening now. He looked at his hands with a gentle smile, as just now the young lady had been holding his hands tightly. He sighed heavily, as he knew perfectly well that the reason she had changed so much was because of the young man who was a fraud. Joseph sighed heavily, as he was confused by the whole situation. Zeke looked closely at his sister and asked where she had gone. He wanted to know if she had been to the casino again. The young lady smiled and said that she had just met someone. The maid told her mistress that she looked like she was in a good mood and seemed to have enjoyed her walk, considering how happy she had been lately. The young lady, in turn, was a little surprised, but at the same time she learned that it was true because she had received more pleasure in this life than in the past. She didn't allow herself to be pressured again, and now she had people she considered her friends. The maid smiled and asked the lady if she had really gone on a date with the man she had met at the casino. The young lady was embarrassed and said that it was exactly like that. The maid smiled and told her mistress that she had blushed. Zeke looked at his sister in bewilderment and asked what it was about the young man that she liked. Kira thought for a moment and said that the young man was very handsome. He was tall and had a good figure, and it was also easy to talk to him. A moment later, she said shyly again that he was very handsome. They looked at her intently, as if they understood that she had fallen in love with his appearance. The maid smiled, as if she understood that her mistress was weak. She had pretty faces. Zeke, in turn, looked intently at his sister and said coldly that he was very glad that the young man turned out to be very good. The young lady said with a happy smile that she really hoped that she could formally introduce the young man to her brother. Zeke looked at her intently, but did not answer. A moment later, he began feeding her a sweet cake. She thanked him with a smile for his concern. Zeke knew that the day when his sister would officially introduce him to the young man she was currently spending time with would never come. Some time later, the young man visited the traffic department. He was furious because he wanted to know who had rented the entire airship. He furiously asked the young man if he was really going to ignore the Viscount. The young man sighed heavily and said that they had been asked to keep it a secret, so he couldn't say. Aiden was furious. He wondered what kind of status the young lady had if they couldn't tell him something like that. As the young ladies passed by, they talked for. They had heard that there was an airship in the square, and they knew that there was a problem with the airship, so a mechanic came aboard and fixed it. Aiden flinched and froze in place as he realized that the young ladies were speaking exactly the same way as his companion. He was scared and wondered if he would be in danger here because of a little mistake. In turn, he was very frightened, since he assumed that his companion was not a simple aristocrat at all. He wondered if she really was a relative of the Imperial family. He was scared and worried, but in turn he understood perfectly well that there was no evidence that he was playing with her, so he restrained himself. He knew perfectly well that he still had a chance to get out of this mess safe and sound, because he had never asked her out on a date, and the greatest touch was when he held her hand. He understood that refusing her to go to the banquet together was a brilliant decision on his part. In turn, the young man prayed and hoped that he would never see her face again. Some time later, the butler joined his master with a report from the transport bureau. They demanded payment for the rent of the airship. The Duke said with a grin that it seemed some fool had sent them the bill by mistake. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and said that the young lady had said that a bill would be sent and had asked him to sort it out himself. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise and asked if he really meant to say that this was all the work of a child. He was very surprised because she suddenly rented an entire ship. However, he understood that at her age, he also felt locked in his own house. The Duke said that he understood everything and signed the bill. The butler looked intently at the gentleman and timidly said that it seemed that everything happened because of the young man whom the young lady fell in love with. The Duke looked at his butler in shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The butler also said that the young lady had dinner with an aristocratic man, and they rented an airship and then spent some time together. The Duke froze for a moment as he realized the reason why she was acting differently. He wondered if it was because she was dating a guy. He remembered her sheepishly saying that she was the right age to get married, and also asking if it was time for her to look for a suitable husband. She did not say that she would get married then, but she wanted to use this as an excuse. The Duke understood that she had definitely said such words to justify herself. Then he had understood her words exactly like that. But now he was furious. He understood that he had to ask her personally about everything, because he could not pay without knowing the reason for renting the ship. The butler looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he would really go to her himself, since he could have called the young lady to the Duke. The Duke moved towards the young lady with lightning speed. He said that she would try to hide behind excuses again, and by the time she came, the sun would already be setting, so he now wanted to ask the young lady everything himself. The maids looked at the outfit with burning eyes. They were blinded by the radiant outfit. Kira looked at them in surprise and asked if the dress was really that beautiful, because she thought that all dresses looked the same. They said that this dress was from a famous studio, and the studio was highly valued in society. They asked if she knew a good designer that she liked. The young lady happily said that she knew blacksmiths who could make cool swords and armor. She looked at the maids intently and asked what kind of blacksmiths they liked. The maids, in turn, laughed at her, puzzled. A moment later, the maid heard someone knocking at the door. With lightning speed, she opened the door, as she did not know who was behind it. But a moment later, she froze in place from the slag as she saw the Duke in person. The young lady, in turn, was surprised, as she did not expect to see the Duke. He looked at her intently and said that he had arrived on account of the Transport Bureau, and therefore he had some questions for her regarding the situation. The maid looked timidly at the Duke and asked if he would like a cup of tea. The Duke said that he did not need anything and asked the maid to leave them for a while. The maid looked at the Duke in a hurry and asked him what he wanted. Then he looked at her coldly, and she trembled. The young lady, in turn, understood that she had not behaved as she had in the past, but she did not understand why he had come to her now. She looked at the Duke intently and sighed heavily, saying that the rent should not be so high. The Duke said that she didn't need to do that just because it was a small amount, because regardless of the reason for renting the airship, it was something that he, as the head of their family, should know about. She looked at the Duke sharply and said that if that was his intention, he could have simply called her into his office. He sighed heavily and asked if she would have responded quickly to his challenge. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking away from the Duke, asked for forgiveness. The Duke said that he had not come to her to criticize her decision. He had heard that there was a man she was dating, and so he had only come to ask if it was because of him that she had started behaving this way. The young lady, in turn, was confused by what she heard. She looked at him intently and asked him hastily how he knew about it. She looked hastily at the Duke and said that this was not yet the kind of relationship that she should advertise. The Duke froze for a moment as he realized that the butler's words were true. Kira sighed heavily and said that she would be more careful with her spending in the future. The Duke said that it was not something he wanted to talk to her about. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about, but the Duke in turn hesitated, not knowing where to start. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was behaving in such a way. She wondered if he was going to use this against her to prevent her from going to the party. With lightning speed, the young lady rose and said that if he had nothing more to say, she would like to be alone, as she did not feel very well. The Duke was a little puzzled by her behavior and shouted at her to stop. She looked at him intently and asked if there was anything else he wanted to tell her. The Duke was puzzled. He didn't know if he had the right to even ask why she had changed so much. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter and she could rest. As he left, he asked her to take care of herself. The Duke left the young lady's room and slowly returned to his own. He remembered how she used to run to him with a radiant smile and how she used to affectionately call him father. But now he was very much puzzled because she had changed a lot, and he did not understand the reason for her changes. The maids looked at the young lady with joy as they saw that the outfit suited her perfectly. The young lady looked at the maids with a smile, but she was very worried because she had to attend the banquet alone without her family. She knew that her grandfather was also expected to attend tonight, and she wanted to come up with a plan to avoid the worst before the young lady arrived. A moment later, she stepped outside and spotted her Mountain King escort. She looked at the young man intently. "Hey," called him. She was surprised because she saw that today he was very elegant. Joseph, in turn, froze for a moment from the beauty of the young lady. She looked at him with embarrassment and asked if she looked strange, since it was the first time she had worn such an outfit. The young man was taken aback and said that it was not so. He looked at her intently, and embarrassed, she said that she looked very aesthetically pleasing in this outfit. And for a second, he was speechless because she was so beautiful and that she outshone the goddess herself. The young lady looked at the young man with confusion, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She smiled and said that she had no idea that he was so good at flattery. She said with a smile that they should hurry up and leave because they might be late. He extended his hand to her with a smile, and they walked leisurely towards the party. Some time later, the young people arrived at the estate, but everyone present was surprised, as they did not expect the young lady to be present at such an evening. The Franks invited the young lady, but did not expect her to actually come. A moment later, young people slowly entered the hall. Joseph looked intently at the young lady, not taking his gaze off her. The madam looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time, and also asked how she had lived all this time. Kira looked at the madam with confusion, as she didn't know who they were, but she felt like she had seen them somewhere. She looked at them closely and said with a smile that she was fine, and also asked how they were doing. Madam smiled and thanked the young lady for coming to their party today. A moment later, there was a dead silence between them. Kira was shocked and confused because she didn't know what she should say. Joseph looked at everyone present and said with a smile that my lady must be tired because she had not attended such events for a long time, so she could feel tired. He said that if she was dizzy, he could take her to the terrace. The young lady apologized, and they slowly walked to the terrace. Joseph looked closely at the young lady and asked if everything was okay. She smiled and thanked him for saving her. Joseph looked at the young lady and asked her anxiously if she wanted to go outside. Kira said that she didn't want to do that, and she would sit down nearby and have a little snack since she had only been able to eat once today. Joseph smiled and said that in that case, he would bring her something to eat. She sighed heavily, as she also really wanted to spend time with someone and talk to other people. She glanced sideways at the young ladies who were sitting nearby. She looked at them intently, as she wanted to spend time like they did. The young lady noticed that they were having a good time. At the same time, the young ladies entered into casual conversation. Kira, in turn, overheard their conversation. She knew that their family also had the tears of the goddess. However, if she interfered, she would ruin it for them. She sighed heavily since she came to the holiday to have fun. A moment later, the young lady froze for a moment as she felt someone's gaze on her. But after a few seconds, she screamed, and everyone looked at her alarmed. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if it had happened to her again. As she screamed as if she had seen a ghost, she turned around and looked intently at the young lady. All the ladies screamed as they saw Kira's cold gaze. They approached the young lady and asked for forgiveness because they did not know that she was resting, and unfortunately they dared to make a noise. They asked her to rest and said that they would not disturb her. The young girls left in a flash. Kira was shocked because she didn't have time to say anything and only shouted after them that they could continue to make noise. She sighed heavily as she knew she wouldn't be able to start a conversation with anyone. A moment later, a young man approached her and informed her that the Marquise was looking for her. Kira, in turn, was a little surprised, as she did not expect to meet her grandfather so quickly. She knew perfectly well that she had to tell Joseph that she was leaving, but unfortunately, she did not see him anywhere. A moment later, she told the young man to take her to the Marquis. The Marquis looked closely at his granddaughter and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. She looked at him intently and said she was very glad he was in good health. He smiled and said his heart felt the same. Kira looked at the Marquis intently and asked if he would listen to her. The Marquis smiled and said that of course he would listen to her because they were one family. He looked at her intently and asked why she wanted to see him so much. Kira, in turn, said that she had one question. She sighed heavily and said that her mother had once told her that the Duke had another woman. She looked at the Marquis intently and asked if it was Rowena Weinberg. The Marquis froze for a moment. Kira, the Marquis has a matter. Could it be that this woman was unable to give birth, so she was expelled? The Marquis looked at his granddaughter in surprise and asked if she really wanted to meet him to ask about this. Kira, that's exactly it, and she would like to get an honest answer. She asked if a woman couldn't have children. Cozette was stuffed, but still she looked like a copy of the Duke. Only Farvis, the chosen of the goddess, could possess the magic of the spirit. The young lady, in turn, would very much like to know whether the girl was related to their family. The Marquis sighed heavily and, looking away, said that it was true, and the woman could not have children. Kira looked at the Marquis intently, as she didn't think he would say anything else. She knew he definitely had something to hide. She remembered the moment when her grandfather had pleaded for her innocence until the very end. He had shouted furiously that the young lady was the Duke's own blood, for he knew that his daughter's child would never deceive the Duke. He shouted to the Duke that he was sure of it. She knew that he was not one of those who would make such an unfounded assertion just because of kinship. She looked intently at the Marquis and said that she believed him. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and now they needed to get to the main thing. Kira said that she needed a refuge, a place away from the capital, which only she and he would know about. The Marquis looked at his granddaughter in surprise and asked why she needed something like that. Kira turned around and slowly walked towards the exit, saying that he would find out when he told her the truth. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she said. Kira told the Marquis with a smile that he was hiding something. The Marquis looked at his granddaughter with a smile and said that it turned out that the threat had increased. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had committed a crime and was now afraid that she would be judged. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry since she was the next owner of the gift, that any of her misdeeds would be overlooked. She sighed heavily because she knew the problem was that she might not be next. The young lady saw the image of the spirit before her death, but she still wanted to be sure that it was not an illusion at all. She smiled and told the Marquis that he need not worry, as she only wanted to make sure of her own safety in case anything else happened. The Marquis smiled and said that since he was old, such an answer did not sound comforting enough to him. As she left, the young lady told the Marquis that he should not forget that they were a family, connected by the same blood. She knew that she was the most important part of the Marquis's achievement of power. The Marquis looked at his granddaughter in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. But a moment later, his expression changed, and he looked at his granddaughter with a gentle smile. He looked at her in surprise and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and it seemed that she was about to finish their conversation. She smiled and said that too long a conversation between relatives would not please the Duke, because soon there would be a reception in honor of Zeke's birthday, and they could meet there again. The young lady, in turn, knew that everything was going as usual, and she had already prepared for the worst outcome of events. She knew that the shelter would be a safety net for her. Kira knew that if things continued like they had in the past, she would need a place to escape to. Cozette's true face and sentence her to death, but in turn, she understood perfectly well that everything could go wrong. Now she did not want to be as helpless as before. She understood that now no one could drag her to the guillotine. She sighed heavily as everything that was happening calmed her down a little. A moment later, the young lady heard a painfully familiar voice. She turned around and stood frozen in place, for a moment listening to the conversation. The young man looked at his companion and said with a smile that her shy image was beautiful, so he was intoxicated by the scent of rose petals. Wilford, observing the young man, noticed that his behavior did not correspond to his status. He wondered if this wasn't the perfect moment for the young lady to see his true colors. Raina said with fury in her voice that the young lady should see it with her own eyes. A moment later, she told her friend that they must hurry and bring the young lady to the man immediately. Wilford looked at Joseph and said that their target was now moving into the garden. Joseph said that he understood everything and would go at once and take the young lady. A moment later, Joseph came to the place where he had recently left the young lady. He was shocked because she was not there, and he did not understand where she had gone. With lightning speed, the young men ran around the estate in search of the young lady. Wilford anxiously shouted to the commander that now was the most opportune moment to expose the young man. But a moment later, they stopped and turned around because they heard a noise. They were surprised when they saw a young lady jumping from the terrace. They froze in surprise as they saw the lady's dark gaze. The Marquis looked at his granddaughter in surprise and asked in confusion where she was going, and he also wanted to know if she was hurt, but the young lady did not answer him. Joseph looked at Milady in surprise and called her, but she ignored him. In turn, the young lady was heading towards the young man who was flirting with another. With the speed of lightning, she approached him and grabbed him by the clothes. Kira looked at the young man with cold fury and asked what he was doing here. Aiden was taken aback and froze in place, in shock, as he did not expect to see a young lady at such an event. He did not understand how she got to the celebration. She looked at him with cold fury and asked if he hadn't told her earlier that he had a book club meeting. The young man froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She angrily asked why he didn't answer her question. Aiden screamed and asked her to let him go first. Wilford glanced sideways at his friend and asked what was going on here. Raina said with a smile that fortunately, this was a very good arrangement. A moment later, the young lady casually threw the young man to the ground, and he fell with a thud. He was shocked and did not understand where a woman could get so much strength from. The lady looked at her companion with concern and asked if everything was okay with him. She also wanted to know who the woman was, who was touching him now. He smiled and told his companion that everything was fine, and she should not worry about anything. He sighed heavily and said that he had no idea who was standing in front of him. Now Kira, in turn, was angry. She did not expect to hear anything like that from him. She attacked the young man with cold fury, but fortunately she was stopped by the knights. Reyna screamed at the princess to come to her senses, because ordinary people might be weaker than she thought. Wilford screamed anxiously at the princess that if she hit him as hard as she could, he would die. The young lady screamed furiously that she only wanted to hear his justification. She looked at him angrily and said that he would still have to convince her. The young man, in turn, stood dumbfounded on the spot, wondering if they had just called her a princess. He knew very well that there were 4 princesses in their country. Among them, there was a princess whose appearance he did not know. Precious spirit-controlling child, Kira Farvis. He sighed heavily as he realized that he was in terrible trouble. A moment later, he looked away from her and said that, not knowing what she wanted from him, everyone present was shocked by his behavior. She looked at her in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She said that his meeting was cancelled, so he simply accepted the invitation from the Marquise's wife. He looked at her with cold fury and shouted that, in the end, he had fooled the lady, but he was shocked at the power with which she bossed people around. Kira looked at the young lady closely and asked who she was to him. Aiden sighed heavily and said that she was his partner. Kira said that the young lady did not look like a simple importer. He looked at the princess in surprise and said that she spoke as if she were his lover. He looked at the princess intently and, with a grin, said that they had one dinner together, but if anyone heard her, they might misunderstand her words. The young lady looked at the young man in shock and asked if he had really said that they had only had dinner together. Even though she had never been in a relationship before, she knew they were on a date and not a casual dinner. It was shocked and did not understand how he could be so impudent and pretend to be innocent. Kira, in turn, flared up with rage and anger. Reyna looked at the princess intently and said that she thought beating him up a little wouldn't be such a bad idea. Kira looked at the young man with eyes full of rage, because she knew that everything was right and a blow would be the best answer. The young man was taken aback and shouted to the princess to stop and wait. He was in shock and begged someone to help him, but it was all in vain, as the young lady was heading towards him with a furious fist. With the speed of lightning, she dealt him a furious blow across the face. The young man fell to the ground with a thud, unconscious. Reyna looked at the young man closely and asked if he would die here if they just left him alone. Joseph sighed heavily and said that he would take care of it. He knew he had to take care of the princess first. Joseph slowly walked up to the princess and called her. The young lady said with tears in her eyes that she had left her shoes on the terrace. He was surprised and looked at her intently without saying a word. Reyna shouted that she would bring it immediately. They shouted that they would return to her immediately. Joseph looked at the princess intently and asked if she wanted to go back. The young lady screamed with tears in her eyes that she hated this the most. She cried out in tears that she wanted to have fun and enjoy herself before going home, but she couldn't go home depressed over some piece of trash. She knew it was right, and she couldn't ruin this day because of some jerk. She knew that slapping him across his pretty face was a good idea. She looked intently at the young man, who was lying on the ground with a distorted face, and cursed him in every possible way. She sighed heavily as she was trying very hard to be nice. She flared up with rage as she wanted to beat him harder. A moment later, the princess was informed that her shoes had been brought. Joseph looked closely at the princess and slowly put her shoes on. Joseph, looking at the princess, asked if she was better. Wiping away her tears, she said that she was already much better. Joseph looked the princess in the eye and said that she did not need to be sad because she was just a little unlucky. He took his gaze away from her and said that he was sure she would still have a good relationship. She was silent for a moment but still agreed with him. He extended his hand to her with a smile and said that the reception was not over yet. He smiled a gentle smile and asked if she would like to dance with him. The young lady in turn froze for a moment, as she did not expect such a thing. Kira bowed to her partner and said with a smile that she hadn't danced for a long time, so she might step on his foot. He smiled and said that everything would be fine. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if it was true. He smiled and said it was. He asked if it would hurt more than the princess's blow during the battle. The young lady looked at her companion with a radiant smile, as she was touched by his words, but still said that perhaps it would be so. A moment later they began to whirl in a dance. She looked closely at the young man, as she noticed that he was very handsome. Joseph looked away from the young lady, not understanding why she was staring at him so intently. A moment later, their eyes suddenly met. He looked at her with confusion, as he was a little puzzled. Kira looked at the young man in surprise and asked why he suddenly froze. Joseph timidly asked for forgiveness. Kira looked closely at her companion, as she was happy that he was next to her. The next day, she thought about everything that had happened to her in the evening, because at the reception, she had met her grandfather and resolved the asylum issues. She understood perfectly well that she had already prepared in advance for the meeting with the young lady. But she was puzzled because in the end, she was never able to have a proper conversation with her peers. Unfortunately, her first love turned out to be a loser. She knew that this situation was not that different from the past. Zeke's birthday, the lady smiled and told the young princess that she had seen her once before at a reception. Kira froze for a moment, as she didn't know what to answer the girl. The lady smiled and said that it was quite a long time ago, and therefore she might not remember her. The young lady smiled and introduced herself. She said her name was Daphne Shore, and she was the second daughter of the Shore family. Kira Probko apologized to the young lady for not recognizing her, and also thanked her for her help. Daphne, with a smile, told the young lady that now she had to choose a dessert, and that would be it. The lady with a smile said what desserts were popular in the whole society lately. Kira sighed, as she didn't even know about such a thing. She was confused, as she really didn't know anything about fashion. Daphne looked at the young lady closely and said that her expression was very gloomy. She asked if the young lady was worried about something. Kira sighed and said that it wasn't like that. Unfortunately, she couldn't say that her lack of fashion knowledge and lack of friends bothered her. She was angry with herself because recently she'd promised to be sincere. Kira wanted to throw away all arrogance. She looked away from the young lady and asked what society thought of her. She sighed heavily and said that she was not very knowledgeable about fashion and had no friends at all. Daphne looked at the young lady intently and said that it was simply impossible. She smiled and said that, in fact, yesterday at the reception of the Viscountess, she was not able to exchange a word with her other ladies, because in the banquet hall, everyone kept their own company, so it is not surprising that it was difficult for her. Daphne said that if the young lady really wanted to make friends, then she would do well to attend the tea party. Daphne said with a smile that this time they were organizing a reception for His Majesty. She smiled and asked the young lady if she would like to attend the reception with her. Kira agreed to this proposal with lightning speed. Daphne looked at the young lady with a smile, but she realized that the princess was truly lonely. She realized that not all of the daughters of dukes are good at communication. Kira sighed heavily and said that she had no idea what to talk about at such receptions. Daphne, looking at the princess with a smile, said that it was difficult to start a conversation without a specific topic, and often they only talked about fashion and style. The princess was puzzled by her words, not so much as she unfortunately knew nothing about fashion and style. Daphne looked at the princess with a smile and said that she did not need to worry, as she would tell her what was fashionable these days. Daphne, writing down all the information on a piece of paper, she said that you are a popular musician lately, Joshua Waitgo. She wrote down for the young princess all the musical works that he became famous for. Kira was surprised because the young lady was very well informed. Daphne said with a happy smile that she had previously been involved in organizing receptions for her older brother, but he was the kind of person who was above social nonsense, and she could do nothing about it. Kira looked at the young lady intently and said that she had heard something similar from her mother before. She knew that he was called an outstanding wizard, and so she wanted to ask him about time travel magic. She wondered if they could meet soon. The young lady said with a smile that her elder brother had dodged the tower, but the princess was doing her best to have fun. Kira thanked the young lady with a gentle smile for her kindness, care, and help. Daphne smiled and said that there was nothing to thank her for. The princess looked at her brother in surprise and asked if Lady Farvis had decided to attend her reception. The young princess was surprised and at the same time puzzled. Although she had sent an invitation, she did not understand why the young lady so unexpectedly decided to come to her reception, because previously she had always ignored her invitation. Mikhail looked at his sister closely and said with a smile that the young lady must have a reason why she had not been showing herself in the outside world and had suddenly started actively participating in social events. He told his sister that she needed to observe the young lady and find out the reason for such a sudden change. Bella was shocked by such a statement. She shouted that she did not like it, and she would prefer to cancel the tea party. The prince told his sister that the guests would not be as delighted as the emperor because they knew very well how picky the Farvis were. He said that His Majesty believed that the Farvis family was unwavering and remained neutral, but it was always important to keep friends close and enemies closer, especially when the latter had their own army. Arabella said that Aerie knew this very well, and they could have forced her to do it. The prince sighed heavily and said that the young lady had not even debuted yet, so he asked his sister not to say such nonsense. Arabella was shocked. She screamed that her brother didn't seem to know what kind of person Lady Kira was. She asked her brother if he knew what happened to her when they met at the last questionnaire from the New Year's celebration. Then the young princess slowly approached the lady and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. Arabella only greeted the young lady, but she looked at her with such a look as if she wanted to kill her. Arabella looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she must have heard some news already. Arabella smiled and said that the Viscountess was thrown out of the boutique because she was too rude, and this boutique was very popular among aristocrats. Kira looked at the princess intently, but she in turn was puzzled because she had no idea what the princess was talking about. Arabella looked at the young lady with a timid smile and said that it seemed she had not heard the latest news. Arabella smiled and began to praise the young lady's outfit. Kira looked at the princess intently and said that she was noisy. The princess froze for a moment on the spot. She was shocked by her words. The princess was taken aback and wondered if the young lady had really said that she was making noise. Kira looked closely at the principal and said that today you were in the banquet hall was very noisy. But the princess did not listen to the young lady and tried to get away from her in a hurry. The princess was puzzled as she realized that the young lady was not at all interested in talking to her. The princess stood up abruptly and asked her brother angrily if the young lady had not ignored her. Then what had happened then? She knew very well that she was making fun of the Imperial family, akin to blasphemy. The prince looked at his sister in surprise and asked why then the young lady was not like that with him. It all seemed very strange to him because they had been talking for quite a long time, and he would not say that she had shown him disrespect. They talked for some time about the new military strategy and the difficulties of passing exams. The princess was furious. She wondered if the young lady had ignored her alone. She screamed that all this happened because of her brother. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was something bad. Arabella screamed that he didn't know how rude people could be. She was furious because she knew that people were only making fun of her because her status would decline after marriage, as she would no longer be a princess once she took her husband's title. The prince looked closely at his sister and said that he believed that if the lady was interested in the Imperial family, then she would hardly be concerned about such things. He looked at her intently and said that she should think about it all on her own. Arabella sighed heavily, as she had completely forgotten about this in her attempt to get closer to her. She knew that she needed to get closer to the young lady, but in turn, she thought that this was simply absurd. Arabella looked at her brother closely and said that she would do everything in her power, but still she could not promise anything because she might be ignored again. The Duke looked at his butler in surprise and asked what he had brought him. The butler told the Duke that last time he had asked him to keep an eye on the young lady. The Duke began to study the information that the butler had provided him with intently. He read about an informal meeting with the Marquis, the third son of the Castro family. Aiden Castro was beaten and abandoned. The Duke said mockingly that there was nothing special about it. The butler looked at the Duke intently and said that he had heard that she had met the Marquis on the terrace. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had known in advance that they would be present at the banquet together. The butler looked at his master in surprise, as he assumed that he would want to find out everything in more detail. The butler looked closely at the master and said that the young lady accepted the invitation because Her Highness was soon arranging a tea party. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke believed that she began to show interest in society because of the young man. As far as he knew at the banquet, she was out of sorts and broke up with him. He was puzzled because he was sure that everything would end after all. But now, he did not understand why she was going to tea. He told the butler to call his daughter because he wanted to ask her about it personally. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and said that of course he could call her and ask her about it, but he still wanted to know what exactly the Duke wanted to ask her. The Duke thought about the question for a moment. He sighed heavily, knowing that it would be best for him to return to this issue when she had no more excuses. The Duke said that last time she had answered that it was all because of the search for a worthy match, and he would like to know from her how the search was progressing. The butler sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. As he left, the butler looked closely at the gentleman. As he understood that he was only finding excuses, he wondered if it would not have been better to be more honest with himself. In turn, the Duke sighed heavily and continued to examine the documents. The young lady stood on the terrace and gazed into the distance. She knew that several weeks had passed since her return from the celebration, but unfortunately, she was still unsure of what she had seen before her death. Of course, she had expected in advance that investigating a case involving spirit magic would not be easy, but after a long search, she still had not found the information she needed. The butler's investigation was also unsuccessful. She was puzzled because she understood that the only thing left for her was to meet her grandmother, who also has the gift, Joanna Farvis. At the moment, the only one who can contact spirits. When the young lady was little, she often told her, as the future successor, stories about spirits. Madame also took her to a place where only spirits lived. It was then that the young lady saw Crystal Beatrice for the first time. She thought that if she looked at him again, then she would be able to discover something. Kira Vose, in turn, really wanted to see her right now, since she lived in the capital at the behest of her aunt. Now no one was allowed to visit her without the Duke's permission, and the only exception was the Emperor. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not want to ask the Emperor anything at all. She looked at the butler in surprise and asked if something had happened. Robert looked closely at the young lady and said that the Duke was calling her to him because he was worried about her marriage. She looked at the butler in surprise, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She couldn't believe how such a person could be worried. The butler said that it was also usual for her to respond to the invitation of the Marquis's wife. Moreover, she wanted to attend the princess's tea party. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. She understood perfectly well that the Duke was only concerned about the neutrality of his own family, and he was not concerned about her at all. As she left, she told the butler that she was still looking for a partner. Some time later, they walked slowly towards the Duke. The young lady looked in surprise at the maids who were leaving her room in a hurry. A moment later, the butler informed the Duke that the young lady had come to see him. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and called her Kira, stood frozen in surprise for a moment as she saw that the handmaids had set the table for them. He looked intently at his daughter and said that she should sit next to him. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect him to eat cake. Kira looked closely at the Duke and noticed that he looked nervous. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his daughter if her search for a groom was going well. She thought for a moment and said that no one had spoken directly about marriage yet. He looked at her intently and said that it seemed that everything was going to ruin. The young lady cried out that this was not so and that she would definitely succeed. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand the reason for such cruelty. He knew that earlier she said that it was just an excuse. He wondered if she really wanted to get married. He understood that there might be a misunderstanding, as if he was against it. The Duke understood perfectly well that as the head of the family, he was not capable of loving children like ordinary parents. Even earlier, he decided that he would not interfere in their affairs. He assured himself that it did not matter whether it was a date or marriage. The main thing was that such actions would not affect the family. He looked at his daughter and said that it was all so, and she was free to do as she wished. The young lady thanked him for such words, and she also asked if the grandmother was in good health. The Duke said that because she was already in her old age, her health was not as it was before, and the doctor reported that she had a severe form of asthma. Kira looked at her father closely and said that since she was already old, she wanted to see her before it was too late. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she would be very glad to have her visit. The young lady rose up with lightning speed and said that she thought it would be a good idea to meet her grandmother this weekend. She told the Duke that if he wanted to set a precise time, he should tell the butler. She looked at the Duke intently at last, but said nothing, and left silently. She thought for a moment as she noticed that the Duke's expression was full of hopelessness. She wondered if he was so concerned about the family's neutrality. She sighed and thought, because as a child she couldn't stand meeting her grandfather. Kira understood perfectly well that his thirst for power was amazing, but in turn she wondered what he was really hiding from her. Kira knew full well that the answer could be the decisive key for her. The maids whispered among themselves with a smile, because they had heard that they would have a special guest today. They did not understand where Her Highness had met Lady Fervis, because they knew that she had not previously participated in social receptions, but still they assumed that she wanted to take part in the princess's tea party. The young ladies whispered among themselves, as they could not even sleep, because they were too excited. After hearing that a mysterious noble aristocrat would be attending the reception, they knew that she was a person who had a lot of work, and they could not even remember her face. Arabella sighed heavily. She wondered if she would be able to successfully conduct the tea party. The maid looked closely at the young princess and announced that the lady had arrived. The princess looked closely at the young lady who had a soft expression on her face, but in turn, everyone looked intently and tensely at the young lady. Kira greeted the princess with a gentle smile. The princess looked at the ladies intently and greeted them. In turn, the princess noticed that they were a little tense. Some time later, the young ladies were sitting at a table and engaged in casual conversation. Arabella looked at everyone present and with a smile introduced today's special guest. The young man looked at the lady with a smile and introduced himself. Joshua smiled and said that he was very honored to receive an invitation from the princess. The young ladies were delighted because they could see the famous young man. Daphne quietly whispered to the young lady and told her who was in front of her now. The young man bowed with lightning speed and tenderly kissed the princess's hand. He smiled and said that he usually did not accept songs on request, but for such a beautiful princess, he made an exception. He smiled and said that he was very glad that today was the opening day of the tea party, and he had the chance to be her guest. He also said with a smile that he would do everything that the princess wished for. Kira, while drinking her tea, thought that the young man was quite funny and easy to get along with. She knew that men were more honest and less serious. Arabella looked at the young lady intently and asked if there was any composition she would like to hear. The young lady in turn shuddered, not knowing what to answer. She nervously clutched the cheat sheet that her friend had written for her. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily and said which composition she would like to hear. The young man smiled and said that it was just a coincidence, but her choice fell on his own composition. She smiled and said that she had heard earlier that a graduate of the academy had been given the honor of performing this composition during graduation. Dante looked at the young lady with a happy smile and quietly said that she was doing well. Kira was surprised and at the same time happy because they were able to talk. The princess glanced sideways at the young man who was playing his composition. She looked excitedly at the young lady and said that the news had surprisingly spread like birds throughout the capital, and she had not expected at all that the young lady would actually attend this reception. Kira was worried because she had run out of notes and didn't know what to say. Dante smiled and said that the young lady was not in the concert hall, but seemed to be enjoying the music now. Arabella looked at the young lady closely and said that it seemed she was right. The princess was a little puzzled because the young lady was only with her not so much as if. Arabella knew perfectly well that no matter how strong and influential her family was, they had to be polite to the Imperial family. She knew that such an attitude would inevitably lead to questions about the Duke's loyalty, as her brother had said earlier. Arabella knew that even though she was in a bad mood, she still had to finish her task. She looked at the lady closely and said that she had actually been very worried today. Arabella smiled and said that she never thought the young lady would accept her invitation, and she wondered what the real reason was. Kira sighed and said that she just thought she should start socializing. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked if her family had no right to not participate in the life of high society. Kira said that this is true. However, being within the family, it is impossible to tie the knot. Everyone suddenly froze and looked intently at the young lady as they were surprised by her words. They looked at the young lady intently and wondered if she had just spoken of marriage. The young people were very surprised because they did not expect that the young lady would ever get married with her character. The lady looked at her in surprise and asked her with embarrassment if she really wanted to marry someone. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was all true because she was already old enough for marriage, so she really wanted to meet a worthy match. The young ladies were surprised and said that the issue of marriage could not be resolved without one's family. They were sure that she would meet a worthy man, and they also wondered if she had anyone in mind. Arabella looked at the young lady with horror and wondered if marriage was her real reason. The princess looked at everyone present with a smile and said that the young lady must be uncomfortable and they should stop asking questions. The ladies looked away from her in embarrassment and apologized for their questions because they were surprised but still managed to make a mistake. Kira smiled and said that everything was fine. They did not need to apologize. Daphne looked closely at her friend and said excitedly that she had not told her that Kira knew perfectly well that her words would soon spread throughout the capital. Sometime later, their lovely tea party ended and everyone gradually dispersed. Kira bowed to the princess and said that she had had a wonderful day. Arabella looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had also had a wonderful day and looked forward to her next visit. A moment later, the young lady turned around and walked towards the exit, but unfortunately her little note fell out of her pocket. The princess looked in surprise at the note that was flying to the ground. The maid in turn slowly presented the princess with a small note. The princess slowly and intently began to read the small cheat sheet. She looked at the cheat sheet in surprise, as she did not understand what she had read. At the same time, the young lady ran in a hurry to the princess and called her. She froze for a moment in embarrassment as she realized that the princess had read her note. Some time later, the young lady and the princess were sitting in the living room. The princess was looking closely at a small cheat sheet. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if it was hers. Arabella was surprised and did not understand why the young lady carried something like that with her. Arabella saw from the note that it was all about modern fashion and style, and it didn't seem like the kind of information one would be laughed at for, but she couldn't believe that the young lady carried such things with her. Kira looked at the floor in embarrassment and said that she was very afraid that she would not be able to make small talk. The princess froze in shock and wondered if these were her clues. The young lady said sheepishly that she was not so familiar with the topics of conversation among aristocrats. Arabella was surprised because she knew that the young lady was also a member of the nobility. Kira sighed heavily and asked how she could know what was popular these days if she was always in the castle. She sighed heavily and looked away from the princess in embarrassment. A moment later she said that no matter who spoke to her, she often did not know what to answer. Arabella looked at the young lady and asked if she really didn't want to look uneducated. The young lady in turn blushed with shame. Arabella asked the young lady why she had accepted her invitation, since she knew that it would have been better to look for a groom at a ball than at a women's gathering. Arabella assumed there was another reason for her coming out. The young lady sighed heavily and quietly said that it was because she just wanted to make friends. Arabella choked because she did not expect to hear anything like that. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was even talking about. Kira said that after the few banquets she had been to, she didn't want to be considered boring because she couldn't hold a conversation. After all, she understood that if everything continued like this, she would become the object of gossip. She sighed heavily and said that she did not want to be alone at the party. Kira said sheepishly that she actually really enjoyed today's tea party. The princess froze in shock as she didn't expect to hear something like that. Kira smiled and said that whenever she saw the princess with her friends, she always wanted to join in, but she only watched from the sidelines because she was afraid that the atmosphere would immediately be ruined if she came. She said that she was very happy to talk with them today. Arabella was shocked and, rising abruptly, told the young lady that this was simply impossible. Arabella was furious because she knew that every time they encountered each other, the young lady looked at her with a murderous look. She was puzzled and did not understand why the young lady looked at her like that. Arabella shouted at the young lady that she must think about it if she had any conscience. Kira sighed heavily as she now realized how she looked. From the outside, Arabella shouted at the young lady that if she continued to silently look at someone with such a scary expression on her face, people might misunderstand her. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that the princess was telling the truth. Arabella was shocked. She did not understand how the young lady could be so innocent. Kira looked closely at the princess and said that she did not look well. She told the princess that if she was not well, then they could continue the conversation later when she had rested and come to her senses. Arabella sighed heavily and, looking away from the young lady, said that perhaps this was exactly the case because lately she had not been able to sleep, so she had not been feeling well. A moment later, the young lady withdrew and left the princess alone. The princess was shocked by everything that had happened, and she felt very ashamed because she now realized that the young lady had not wanted to ignore her at all. Now she realized that she had been wrong all this time about the young lady. A moment later, the prince entered the room and called his sister, saying that he had heard that she had just had a meeting with Lady Kira. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she had found out anything. Arabella sighed heavily and said that the young lady was currently looking for a groom. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Arabella said that being in the palace, it was impossible to meet anyone, and she said that she was just starting to integrate into society because she had just reached the right age for marriage. The prince thought for a moment, for he knew that there was some sense in this, but he still looked at his sister in surprise and asked if that was really the only reason she had come out into society. The prince looked at his sister intently and said that she had previously thought that the young lady had ignored her. He asked how her tea party had gone. The princess shuddered as she realized that she had made a huge mistake. She sighed heavily and said that it was just a misunderstanding. and now she realized that the young lady was not as arrogant as she had previously thought. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he couldn't wait for her kind attitude. She looked at him in surprise and asked what his words meant. As he left, the prince said that she should get closer to the young lady. Arabella was shocked and shouted to her brother that they were not finished talking yet, but he did not want to hear anything. Daphne called out to the young lady in a hurry because she was excited. She looked at the lady closely and asked how everything went. Kira smiled and said that everything went well, and she was able to return the note. She said that it seemed like there was a misunderstanding between her and the princess. Daphne let out a heavy breath and said she was glad to hear that, because her heart had almost jumped out of her chest. Daphne looked closely at the young lady and asked what else she meant by marriage. Daphne was shocked and didn't understand how the young lady could not tell her about it. Kira looked at the lady with a smile because she knew that it was all just a distraction, but in turn she smiled and said that it embarrassed her a lot. Daphne glanced sideways at the young lady and said that she should have given her something earlier. She smiled and handed her an invitation to their family's annual party. She smiled slyly and informed the young lady that she had also sent an invitation to some attractive young men. Kira looked at the young lady intently as she was ready to give up on this idea, but a moment later she saw her expression, and with a heavy sigh she agreed to come to the party. Daphne looked at the lady closely and said that she should let her know when she chose her partner because she should tell others, show special attention. Kira thought for a moment as she thought about inviting Joseph to go with her. The young lady looked at her friend closely and said with a smile that she would definitely find her destiny at the party. The young man screamed with rage because he was very angry that he could not remember this information. He was very much concerned about this state of affairs, but unfortunately, he could not do anything. He looked closely at the various letters, as he did not know when they had managed to send them. He sighed heavily, as he knew that this was very problematic for him. All the guests at the banquet looked at the young lady in surprise, as they did not expect her to attend this celebration. They were also surprised that she was acquainted with the Viscount. Now they were convinced that she really entered society to find a husband for herself. The young lady looked at Joseph intently and smiled and thanked him for agreeing to be her partner. He smiled and said that he didn't need to be thanked at all, and he really hoped that she would have a good time. Daphne looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and called her. She looked at the young lady intently and asked her a lot of questions, and she also said that she had invited all the best men. No young man would be good enough for the young lady, but she had tried her best to help her find the perfect companion. The young lady thanked her with a smile. A moment later, the young lady said that she had to go and greet the guests. She told her friend that if she liked anyone, she should tell her about it. Joseph looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they seemed to be very close. Kira smiled sheepishly and said that it was true, and the young lady was her new friend. Kira smiled and began to talk about the tea party she had attended earlier. A moment later, she started and froze in place as she saw the princess. According to all the rules of etiquette, she greeted the Princess Arabella in turn, froze in place for a moment. Kira looked closely at the princess and smiled a tight smile. Arabella was horrified. She hoped that the young lady would not smile again, because her smile frightened her even more. Arabella smiled and told the young lady that they met again. She said that she was attending an event with her friends today. She asked the young lady if she would like to meet the young ladies. Arabella knew that there was no misunderstanding between them, but everything became even more frightening. Arabella knew that the young lady had a partner, and she might not agree, and in turn, she very much hoped for it. Kira looked at the princess with an admiring smile and said that she would be happy to meet her. The princess was shocked because she did not expect such a thing. The young lady turned around and looked intently at his particular companion. Joseph smiled and told the young lady that she did not need to worry about him, as he could join her later. As she left, she thanked him with a smile for his support Joseph looked at the young lady closely, for he was very glad that she was changing and making friends. Joseph looked at her intently, as if he saw that she was happily making new acquaintances. Daphne stared at all the guests present, but a moment later she froze as she heard a familiar voice. She turned around and saw her brother, who was looking at her with a sweet smile. She looked at her brother in surprise, as she did not expect to see him at this event. The young lady looked at her brother and informed him that it had been previously assumed that he would not be able to come because he was again sitting in his tower. She was surprised, not understanding what had happened, that he had decided to show up. He smiled and said that he was the eldest son. He said that it would be impolite on his part not to show himself in public at least once. She looked at him intently and began to lecture him. The young man sighed heavily and looked away from her, as he was not in the mood to listen to her. He sighed heavily and turned around to say that he had heard the young lady had been at a party today. He wanted to know where Lady Kira had been. Daphne glanced sideways at her brother and pointed out where the young lady was now. She said he should look at the lady with black hair in a silver dress. He looked at her closely and said that she was very beautiful. Daphne smiled and asked who could be more beautiful than their lady. The young man, in turn, suddenly stopped and looked intently at the lady. Daphne looked at her brother in surprise and asked if something was wrong. Eris, without taking his eyes off the young lady, said that he was not sure, but it seemed to him that he had seen her somewhere. He sighed heavily and said with confidence that they had met somewhere. He said that he needed to confirm his feelings, so he rushed towards the young lady. But Daphne stopped him. Eris was a little puzzled by his sister's behavior because she irritated him. He used magic, and the young lady froze in place, as if spellbound. He smiled and said that he had urgent business to attend to, and asked if she would let him go. She sighed heavily and let him go. With the speed of lightning, the young man left his sister's company and went towards the lady, and Daphne stood and watched him as if spellbound. Eris walked up to the young lady with lightning speed, and with a grin quietly whispered in her ear that if she had already returned, then she needed to find him first. He looked at her intently and asked with a grin what she was doing here. The young lady turned around and looked at the young man in surprise. She was shocked because she didn't understand what he had just done. Kira froze in place for a moment in shock. She looked closely at the young man, who was looking at her with a smirk on his face. She wondered if he had just said that she was back. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't remember. He said that he used magic that time. Kira froze for a moment and remembered the expression on his face when he used magic and reverted it back. She unconsciously touched her throat as she felt pain throughout her body. The young man looked at her with a fierce grin and said that he was very glad that he had finally found her. They looked at each other in silence for a while. After a few seconds, he said with a grin that she was the one who returned. The young lady was taken aback and froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at his expressive gaze. Kira understood perfectly well that she had seen him before, and he was not one of the most pleasant on her life's path. She was puzzled because memories from her past life came flooding back to her, and the pain she had endured came flooding back to her, and she staggered from helplessness. Joseph looked at the young lady with concern and caught her and asked if she was okay. Eris, in turn, froze in place for a moment in shock. He said, puzzled, that he hadn't meant to scare her at all. Joseph, with the speed of lightning, covered the young lady with his body and shouted to the young man that the young lady was from the Farvis family, so he should carefully watch his manners. Eris looked closely at the young lady and, with a gentle smile, said that there was something he would like to hear from her. He said with a grin that she would also not mind listening to him. The young lady, in turn, shuddered at his words. Kira looked closely at her companion and said that she would now have a little chat with the young man. She asked Joseph to wait. Joseph, in turn, was shocked as he did not expect such a thing. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that he would be nearby if she needed help. As she was leaving, the young lady nervously told the young man that they should go to the restroom, as they could not continue the conversation here. He looked at her with a smirk and said that he would do as she wished. A moment later, they were hurrying towards the restroom. But in the meantime, everyone was looking closely at the young people and whispering quietly. Some time later, they came to the restroom. Lady looked at him intently and asked if he had said earlier that she was back. The young man sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he knew that she had returned to the past. He smiled and said that it was all because he was the one who turned back time. He looked at them intently and said that due to magic, she still had her memories. The young lady flinched, as she didn't expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently and asked why he did that. He sighed heavily and said that she should tell him about this, not about her. He said that they usually didn't play with time because there was too much risk, but he still left clues as a hope, because with such stupid magic, you can lose all your memories. Erez looked at the young lady intently and asked what the last thing she remembered before returning was. The young lady in turn clenched her fists in rage and sighed heavily as she said that she remembered her own execution. Eris froze in shock after hearing what he looked at her intently and asked what she was talking about. He sighed heavily, not understanding how this was even possible. She looked at him intently and asked if he really was a magician. Eris said that it was true and also asked if she didn't believe him. She looked at him intently and said that time magic was not studied in the tower. Eris sighed heavily and said in a puzzled tone that it was because in this world they didn't study her, but a moment later he said that it didn't matter at all and he could just show her his abilities. A moment later, the young man used magic and the flowers opened up and blossomed before his eyes with lightning speed. But after a few seconds, he used his magic and the flowers withered before our eyes. He sighed heavily and said that time magic was a very complex thing, and he was the only one in this world who could interact with its flow. Erez said that time mages were almost never encountered, so it was not surprising that she knew nothing about it. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he didn't make an official statement, because if he did, he would be awarded the title of Great Sage. He looked at her in surprise and asked why he was given the title. He sighed heavily and said that this magic had its flaws, because the caster would not remember anything, and then the point of rewinding time would be lost. The young lady sighed heavily and told the young man that he should explain to her in more detail how and on what basis magic works. He sighed heavily and asked if anyone had ever told her that it was very rude to ask. Erez looked at the young lady intently and said that in any case, she had used a time regression spell that she didn't even know about. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that the only lead he had now was her, and she was not trying to get to the bottom of it. She just wanted to help. He sighed heavily and said that such magic required several people, since the first was him, the caster, and someone else. He knew that only one person could return to the past with their memories intact. Other than the caster, the other's role was to choose whose memories they would retain. The young lady was confused. She didn't understand what kind of magic this was. She wondered if this wasn't just self-sacrifice. Kira knew that it couldn't be that it wasn't related to dark magic. He said that the other usually chooses to keep his memories. He knew that the meaning of the future gives an incredible advantage for this reason. He knew that everything happened this way. Then he would put his seal, and after the return of that person, he would find out what happened in the future. One could say that the other one would take on all the shortcomings of this magic. Erez looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this was the reason he approached her, because he thought that she was the other one. She sighed heavily and said that she did not remember casting any spell. Kira sighed heavily and said that she didn't understand what this situation was at all. The young man was confused and angry because for this reason, he didn't want to use magic because he assumed that something unexpected would happen. She sighed heavily and thought for a moment as she realized that it was not she who was with him then, but another person, and it was he who chose to preserve her memories. Eris looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she was smarter than he thought, and he couldn't believe that she understood everything so easily at once. The young lady in turn looked at him with fury but did not answer. A moment later she couldn't stand it any longer and asked why he was speaking to her so informally. He smiled and said that it was just the two of them. He didn't understand if it made any difference. She looked at the young man with a cold, intent look and said that in that case she too would speak informally while they were alone. She sighed heavily and said that he should be polite when someone was looking at them. He looked at her in surprise, but still agreed to try because he knew that it would not be easy. She looked closely at the young man and said that she still did not know his name. A moment later, the young man introduced himself and said that his name was Eris Shore. He looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and said that he was a magician from the tower. He smiled and said that from now on, they would see each other more often. The young man smiled and asked the young lady to take care of him. He smiled and called her by name. She froze for a moment, but still asked what the Shore family had to do with Miss Daphne. He smiled and said that she was his sister. The young lady looked at him intently because she knew that when she looked at her friend, she did not think that there was any problem with homeschooling. But now she believed that the young man was exactly the kind of person who did not care about the opinions of others. The young lady suddenly sat up and told the young man that if he needed her help, he could come at any time. He smiled and said that he needed to stay in the capital for a while. He looked at the young lady in surprise as he noticed that she was staring at the door. Eris asked if she was worried about what the people outside would say. She sighed heavily and said that it was not that simple. Someone was waiting for her. Eris sighed heavily and remembered the young man, but he would blame him later. He said that the young man had a furious look. As she left, the young lady smiled and said that it was impolite for her to leave her partner alone for too long, so she needed to leave first. The young man, in turn, sighed heavily. He did not understand what he was doing here. He did not understand what had happened in the future, that he had turned back time. A moment later, the young lady cried out and called her companion. He turned and looked at her in surprise. Kira walked up to the young man with a smile and apologized for keeping him waiting for so long. She looked at him intently and asked if he had just been standing there the whole time while she was talking to the young man. She sighed heavily and said that he could rest a little. Joseph said that everything was fine, but he still wanted to know who the man was because he had not seen him before. Joseph looked at the young lady with a puzzled look and said that the young man had previously stated that he had found her and that she was the returned one. Kira froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She knew that he shouldn't have said that in front of everyone. She sighed heavily and said that the young man was a mage from the tower. She had previously asked him for advice on time magic, and that was what they had discussed. Joseph looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was talking about a return or a contract now. The young lady sighed heavily and looked away from her companion. She did not know how to explain everything to him. Joseph sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness because he knew that he had bothered her too much, but still he was worried that the young lady could be in danger. She looked at him with a smile because she was glad that she was able to avoid making excuses. Joseph sighed heavily, for he knew that this was all very strange. But still, the young lady asked her friend to keep this conversation a secret from the Duke. Joseph said that he intended to do so. The young lady, in turn, slowly walked back, but she was still confused by this situation. She was puzzled and did not know what could happen in the future. Joseph looked at the lady intently, as he saw that she was very excited. He understood that she was hiding a secret that could not be revealed. A few days later, the story of the young lady's escape with the young magician spread throughout the capital. The young lady looked closely at the Duke, for she saw that he was depressed by everything that had happened. She looked at him with a smile, knowing that everything was going as smoothly as she had planned. The maid looked at the mistress with a smile and said that all the preparations were already completed. She asked the mistress if she wanted to leave right now. Kira smiled and said that she would do just that. Zeke looked closely at his sister and asked if she was okay. He said that wherever he went, everyone was talking about her wedding. He hoped that she didn't actually think about getting married. The young lady in turn understood that most likely things like her wedding would not be so important. The young lady looked at the maid intently and asked if there had been any letters from the Shore family. Rose said that no letters had arrived. The young lady frowned for a moment, but said nothing. The maids stared at the young lady, as they assumed that she had taken a liking to the young master. The Duke, in turn, inadvertently overheard their conversation and froze in shock. With lightning speed, he jumped up from the sofa and called his daughter, but she did not hear him. The young lady looked at the maids with a smile and said that it was time for her to go. The Duke looked intently at his daughter and did not call her anymore. The young man looked at his sister intently and asked when she would be back. She smiled and said that she was planning to stay a few days, so she would write to him before she returned. Zeke hugged his sister with a tender smile and wished her a good trip, and also asked her to say hello to her grandmother from him. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and sat down in the carriage. She knew that before appearing in their family, the girl she needed to find out something about spirits. Sometime later, the young lady arrived at her grandmother's estate. Joanna Farvis greeted her granddaughter with a joyful smile. The young lady greeted her grandmother with a smile and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The madam looked at her granddaughter in surprise and asked if they had not met last month. Kira was taken aback for a moment as she realized that she had made a mistake. Madam smiled and told her granddaughter that she often comes to you lately.